Broadcasting from the dark corners of the earth, it's Tom Mordred's Midnight Radio. Thank you for joining us on this dark night. It's been quite a journey for me today. I say quite a journey, it's been a bit of a day, if you understand my meaning. I'll be honest, I wasn't sure what to read tonight. I thought of doing another short story, maybe some Damon Runyon, but truth is I don't want to have the desk light on for now. I'd have to plug it in and set it up, so I picked something off my Kindle. It's actually something that we started previously, after, I believe, a short story that was done. But regardless, I may do something a little different in the coming days. More specifically, I intend to do a little more proper midnight radio type, what do you call it, content. You know, Bigfoots, aliens, strange encounters of all kinds. But we're not going to worry about that tonight. Tonight, we're going to be reading Faction Paradox. This town will never let us go. It's, for those of you unfamiliar with Faction Paradox, it's a spin-off of a popular British sci-fi series. But other than that, it's completely separate. Wink, wink. Completely separate. It's a separate universe. Alright? Alright. We did start it a little while back as a kind of preview. I think I needed to fill some time. But it is a novel as opposed to a short story, so we're going to get into it, and it'll be our, what do you call it? Our project? Question mark? I wonder, do I have any faction art I can put up? Just a moment. Bear with me, and get settled for a bit. Just relax. If you're in bed, tuck yourself in, or have someone near you tuck you in, if you're living that life. Let's have a look. I probably don't, I'll be honest. You don't need to really know what Faction Paradox is to read this book. This book, while it takes place in the Faction Paradox universe, it's not about Faction Paradox, and that's the theme to all of the Faction Paradox stories, is that they are less about the faction itself and more about other things. Culture and experience. Things that are a little more universal than nerdy sci-fi stuff. No, I don't have any faction images at the moment. Alright, well, we will worry about that some other time, and maybe I'll have it for the next broadcast. But, without further ado, let's begin. Faction Paradox. This Town Will Never Let Us Go, by Lawrence Miles. All characters portrayed in this novel are fictitious. However, the author would like to make it clear that all major presences described here, from Red Mercury upwards, are real, and that none of the procedures featured in this story are wholly imaginary. Zero. Midnight. 0.00. All journeys begin here. Clearly, this is one of those worlds. Or maybe it's just one of those nights that makes it look like one of those worlds. The television's the giveaway. The stopover is the kind of place that's open all night. No, all night, N-I-T-E. And knows that it has to appeal to the kind of person who will, logically, have been driving all night, I-T-E. The fuel pumps are out on the forecourt, but on the inside, it's going for that oasis feel. Not that a genuine oasis would have a chiller cabinet, notes an Angela, who's even now leaning against a locker that houses exotic cold meat products in exotic polythene jackets. But there are certain things you expect from an oasis, and coolness is one of them. On the inside, everything's neon white and neon bright, and neatly tiled and ordered, and only the chocolate bars seem too indiscreet to be tempting. The rest of the place is cold, serene, and angelic. The chocolate shouts in Eastman color. There are bloody red wrapper messages spelled out across the food racks. The stopover hums with electricity, the kind that says safety, not storm. The television's turned up slightly too loud, but the sounds are reassuring. The screen hangs from a bracket behind the cash counter so that one of the forsaken-looking clerk has to turn his back on any potential customers if he feels the need to watch it. And Angela's been staring at it for some time now, while her companion surfs the aisles, putting together a natural history of all the snack foods. A bestiary of snack foods. Yes, all of them are, as an Angela well knows, demons of some kind or another. The program is a repeat, obviously, probably broadcast on one of the many, many late-night kitsch satellite stations. 70s retro is the baseline of all human culture after midnight. The Muppets are getting ready to perform their final musical number of the evening, so all the big players are assembling on the stage. The frog, and the pig, and the bear, and the other one, and an Angela, who knows altogether too much about this sort of thing, nearly has to bite her own flesh to stop herself pointing out to the world that in any good alchemical sequence, the last of the four beasts is always unknown and represents an unidentifiable mystery animal. Stop it, stop it, stop it. You're tired and you need wake-up pills, or you're never going to get through the next few hours. 5 minutes ago, or maybe 10, or maybe 15, she was squinting at the screen and trying to work out who the celebrity guest is on this particular show. The token sacrificial human, an old, sad, beaten-looking man, evidently trying to enjoy his time with these colorful puppet breeds, but realizing that they represent a world he no longer understands. Kermit the Frog described it as a great honor to have him in the studio. And Angela finally identified him, shakily, it's got to be said, as George Orwell. She vaguely recalls that when she first walked into the stopover, the Muppets were in the middle of a comedy reenactment of the Room 101 scene from 1984, starring Rizzo the Rat. Or at least, she thinks she remembers that, but she could be retro-imagining it. Limited kitsch appeal. Kids today barely know the Muppets, and don't have a clue about great English authors. And Angela considers herself to be one of the chosen. I had a boyfriend who liked me to pretend. Oh God. I had a boyfriend who liked me to pretend to be Miss Piggy, says Horror as she scoots past an Angela with a peppermint stick in her hand. 0.01 animal parts. This is funny, for a reason which is nearly but not really cruel. It'd be going too far to say that Horror is fat, exactly. She's not precisely slim, it's true, but she's got the kind of body that allows her at least half a dozen good excuses. Vodka retention is the one that Angela likes best. Unusually wide bone marrow is the other one, although the last time Horror herself tried to use it, she was so drunk that it sounded entirely serious. A frequent risk when you've rehearsed your wit in advance, and it was just embarrassing to watch. But the night's getting hotter. Air-conditioned as the stopover might be, outside there's a superheated wind blowing through the one-way systems and bus lanes. Hot rain expected before the dawn, and Angela may have insisted on the archetypal leather for her coat, but above the waist, Horror isn't wearing anything but a sleeveless t-shirt and numerous piercings. This means that her arms are exposed for all the world to see, and Horror's arms just happen to be exactly the same color as the skin fabric of a Muppet pig, only the slight freckling ruins the illusion. And Angela doesn't snigger when Horror mentions her pig-obsessed former boyfriend, because she's got other things on her mind, and it's hard enough to focus already. She's trying to remember when George Orwell died. It's funny, but she always thought it was in the early 50s, in which case the TV station is taking retro that one step too far. Hi-ya! Says Horror, aiming a fake karate chop in Angela's direction. 0.02. Night under fire. The first of the night's rockets attack, and the word rocket is, as ever, used loosely here. Anything that causes such large amounts of property damage is to be designated either a rocket attack or a terror attack, although the method by which the distinction is made is open to debate. Began at exactly 11... The first of the rocket attacks began exactly at 11:38 p.m., in one of the many, many town squares, which all hope to qualify as the town square. This particular square is, or was, well known for having more hot food stalls than any other, which might explain why Angela was just there before the attack began. On this occasion, most of the citizenry in the square, the teenagers perfecting the art of being nowhere in particular, and the stallholders who'd begun to melt into the atmosphere of hot grilling fat just like salami melts into cheese, somehow managed to stay clear of the flying glass, the building shrapnel, and even the blast point itself. The stalls were less lucky, and Angela imagines them as casualties of war, broken and gasping on the battlefield, breathing out meat-flavored steam as they die. You have to bear in mind that if there's one word to describe the war, it's spurious, which is to say, there's a logic to it, but it's a logic so complex that no matter how hard you try, you can never summon up the will to follow every precise detail, or even enough just to comprehend its shape. What's important is that the town itself isn't the target. The town's of no great value. As far as anyone's been able to ascertain, it serves no strategic function. But some things exist by the strength of their own will, and this is the war. A war so fundamental that it can only be ever described in the singular. The explosions you hear in the distance, the urban craters that smell of liquid accelerant and burning burger fat, they're signs, that's all. The marks the war leaves in the dirt. Nobody would seriously ask why the rockets should target a square full of fast food stands, or even why the missiles should be heading this way at all. It's really very simple. This is the war. And what else should the war do? And Angela is, however, sorry things have turned out this way. Now she'll never get to hold a decent fried malmiotti wrap again. I'm going to take that again. Now she'll never get to hold a decent fried malmiotti wrap ever again. And if there's one thing that's guaranteed to make people turn against the war, it's that kind of inconvenience. .03. An Angela. What an Angela Marrero sees when she wakes in the morning, or more commonly in the afternoon, and looks in the mirror. A girl. Quite specifically a girl. Nothing as mundane as a woman, even though she's at that difficult age where the TV news wouldn't be certain to which word to use if she were to end up as a murder victim. Standing 5'6" tall, or 5'8" if she fell asleep without performing the long, tedious ritual of removing the big black boots with the complicated laces. She weighs 174 pounds, which makes her heavier than Horror, but without the Muppet pig arms. No, the word for an Angela is definitely pallid. In another place and time, she would have ended up as a goth, and even here, in the civilized age, It's not clear whether the Moby Dick white skin is something she's carefully cultivated, or whether she was born in monochrome. If this is a first thing after waking, before any breakfast description of an Angela, then she looks rather uncomfortable as she squints into the mirror, not sure whether all her pieces are in place, or whether she's just forgotten to switch on her radiant beauty. Let's move forward and see what she looks like when she's fully dressed, which is reasonable, because she's bound to check the mirror again on the way out. The long skirt is mandatory, since no man or beast has ever seen her legs, at least not beyond their natural interior environment of a large, well-padded duvet. The leather coat's mandatory too, even if it's not terribly imaginative. Her face hasn't resolved itself much since she squinted at her early morning pre-caffeine features, but she's ingeniously applied makeup in such a way that she now looks fully alert, and will spend much of the afternoon constantly reapplying this illusion. Actually, she's become quite pretty in a round-faced sort of way. Her eyes are very, very bright today. Lipstick applied in a tight red kiss shape counterbalances the fact that she's got a great big mouth. In fact, pretty is not what she's going for. Majestic is what she's going for. The second to last thing she does, before she leaves this imaginary mirror, is use her fingers to sweep back her hair. The hair's naturally black, but dyed red at the ends, where an experiment with scarletine unexpectedly became a fashion statement halfway through. It's very important to make sure that all the red bits are thrown over her shoulders in a mock cavalier kind of way, so it looks like a mane of fire or a halo of living flame, or something. The last thing she does, before she leaves, is pick up the mask from its hook by the door, and snap it into position in front of her face. There. She turns it into a little eclipse, with the smooth, shiny bone, or faux bone, slowly covering up her features one by one. She even raises one eyebrow at herself at the last moment, as if she's giving herself the come-on. Then there's nothing but the face of Faction Paradox, looking back at her, and at us. Now she can leave the house, and head off to wherever she's going on this typical imaginary day. There'll probably be one last paranoid tussle of the hair once she's closed the door behind her. 0.04. Couture. Of course, she's not wearing the faction mask in the stopover. You don't wear masks like that if you're shopping at all-night service stations, however fashionable they may seem. People have an annoying tendency to call the police. And Angela has seen at least one shop with what can only be described as a no faction sign on the door, a crude black and white depiction of one of the masks, big eyes, low-set snout, the works, surrounded by a big red circle with a thick red line all the way through it. In her opinion, it's a symbol that's bound to cause confusion. What's it supposed to say? No members of Faction Paradox, even though the organization's purely mythical? No would-be members of Faction Paradox, and we can tell if you are? And Angela tends to see it as a sign that the faction has arrived as a major cultural force, guaranteed to be this year's entertaining threat to the establishment, and considers it a reflection of the world's overall level of paranoia. The upshot is that she leaves her mask on the dashboard of the van when she goes to buy snack foods. 0.05. Squaring the circle. The square, where the war made itself felt in the town for the first time tonight, now smells of meat. For the most part, human senses are primed to react well to the smell of fried meat. It speaks of generations of protein, but here, in the modern world, there's the fear that's been planted in us by years of exposure to news footage from faraway war zones. What you'd call neo-atavism, possibly. We smell meat, in a place where the skin of the world's been torn up by missile fire and people are dying in the glow of the street lamps, and we wonder if it might be human. But it's unlikely. It's too sweet, too well-tailored to meet our approval. There's malmiotti and smoked sausage on this battlefield, paprika in the air if you can ignore the undertones of something chemical and incendiary. Around the central point of the impact, the food stalls have been blown into wood chips, or just collapsed, leaning lopsidedly around the crater with their grill plates still blowing onion-flavored smoke into the night. You almost expect them to shout, "Medic!" Rocket attacks, in the experience of Valentine Bregman, don't leave behind charred corpses. The weaponry involved is too absolute. That which exists at the point of impact, at one of the many ground zeros, is very rarely left to smolder. Valentine is, incidentally, one of the handful of people who's come to this impact site for what might be called humanitarian reasons. We'll return to him soon enough. The scene of the impact, then. The rocket attack didn't hit the exact center of the square, but the iron fence on one side, so that from above, the crater and the square look like two geometric shapes trying to mate with each other. Normally the food spots would be everywhere, enticing the town's predatory animals to eat their flesh, and this is the perfect spot for that kind of thing. There's an amusement arcade on one side of the square, a nightclub on the other. The attack, of course, has disturbed this ecosystem. One wall of the bar has been consumed by the crater, and the impact shattered most of the glass on that side of the square, as well as blowing out most of the street lamps. This means the casualty, mostly victims of the shockwaves, are largely lit by the glow from the arcade, still open, with its machines still running, in spite of the fact that most of those inside have been escorted out of the area. On the paving stones outside, amidst all the spilled grease and splinters, the bodies of the wounded flash on and off, on and off, on and on, and on and off, and on and off, and on and off, in time with the rhythm of the red lights on the slot machines. At least one of them, not quite thinking straight, and understandably so, given the pain, shock, and strobe effects, will find herself staring at the little devil machine and believing that the next spin of the wheel is going to determine her fate. Psychologists call this synchronicity, and whole systems of thought have been founded on much, much less. Everything is flashing here, though not in a rhythm that makes much sense. The South American restaurant on the west side of the square seems relatively undamaged by the impact itself, but now there's a fire licking at the upper floors of the building, another result of the shockwave as electrical systems jam and gas pipes rupture. The police and paramedics are caught in the crossfire between the firelight and amusement arcade. There's a smear of red in the sky over the square, which Valentine takes to be a side effect of the attack. It could well be trace elements from whatever materials happen to be used in the weapons of war, reacting badly to oxygen and spreading a layer of chemical scent across the grilled cheese and pepperoni landscape, but who knows. There are 3 ambulances at the scene, squeezed into the side streets around the square. 3 isn't a lot, but it was a busy night for reasons other than the war. Many of the crewmen are already arguing with the police about the exact placement of the big "stop," "accident" signs. Even today, 2 years after the war came to town, nobody's issued the emergency services with specific "stop," "war zone" signs. Valentine, marked out as a creature of mercy by his overalls, and not a lot else, skulks his way across the square to see if there's anything more productive he can do. 0.06. Valentine. Valentine doesn't think clothes are particularly relevant, and it shows. Just look. They're as uninterested in him as he is in them. He's got the overalls of an ambulance crewman, but they sit drooping on his shoulders in a decidedly uninterested way. And he wears them unbuttoned so that 2 lapels flap around him like a doctor's uniform. You might argue that either he or the overalls have delusions of grandeur if they didn't look equally sulky. Underneath, and you have to understand that this isn't strictly regulation, he wears a grey t-shirt and a pair of faded jeans, both of which are currently sticking to his pale little body on this hot night. The ensemble says more about him than he might like to think. It says that, as far as he's concerned, he'll be fine as long as people can see why he's hanging around the wounded and the war struck. Tell him that he should smarten himself up, and he'll probably say, okay. But once he's gone, alone, he'll wonder why he bothers listening to hospital management. In fact, there's only one item he wears, which is deliberately geared to make a statement. There's a set of military dog tags around his neck, in silver and on a silver chain. It's his own personal protest against the war, a war in which dog tags play absolutely no part, since everybody's a potential casualty, and no bodies seem to survive anyway. The tags are, naturally, blank. A few people notice this subtle point, very few people notice this subtle political point, and really, it's just a second-rate replacement for the far more overt anti-war stickpin he used to wear, until management made him take it off. These are Valentine's clothes. Underneath, he's not sure that he sees much to see. He's young, spindly, and all too aware of the awkwardness he carries around with him. Not in the sense that he's actually likely to knock things over, but in the sense that he's definitely never been type. He's tall, but not tall enough to be tall, and gangly, and thin, but not svelte enough to look like a glam rock star. He suspects that this discomfort is due to the fact that after a lifetime's exposure to advertising, from the second he was born as it happens, but this is another story, he's never seen a single human being on a commercial who looks like him. He'd like to think that makes him demographically unique, although he knows that, in fact, it just makes him feel like he's made out of acute angles. His hair is short, spiky, and heads off in an impressive number of directions at once, even if the exact nature of those directions changes according to the amount of gel he tries to apply. His face is prone to stubble, which makes him look perpetually worn out. But this is fine, because he drives an ambulance on the night shift, so that's how he's expected to be. He's 22 years old, and he's been told he has a face that makes him look as though he's going to say, "Sorry, what?" to any given question. Occasionally, he gets angry. He gets angry when he sees the aftershock of the war, and he gets even angrier when no one else seems to notice the aftershock of the war. Most people he knows wouldn't be able to imagine him angry, though, because he tends to keep this sort of thing to himself. He's a junior crewman, a position which he sees not only as a way of fighting back against the war and all things related, but also as a kind of sabotage. For him, saving people's lives is a two-finger salute to the wartime powers, at least as much as it is an act of compassion. 0.07 UST. The final musical number is set on a farm. Oh, of course, it's got to be the Muppet version of Animal Farm. The man who must surely be Orwell stands among the pigs, dogs, and mystery animals, doing his best to keep up with the real stars of the show. Who's he supposed to be, though? He's the farmer? Fair enough. Ironic, though, given the farmer's meant to represent the weak, helpless old order, and look at Orwell's face as he's acted off the screen by a bear in a necktie. A bear? In Animal Farm? Pfft. Halfway through the musical number, a rendition of Power to the People, which seems fitting, Miss Piggy gets into a fight with the horse. Nobody can ever remember the name of the Muppet horse. About who's the star. Their argument can be heard above the harmonious wailing of the other Muppets, and thankfully the dispute doesn't end the way it does in the book, but with Miss Piggy throwing a tantrum. "Humph!" she says as she tosses her head back and storms off to her dressing room. "Well, obviously, some animals are more equal than others." Or, that's what it sounded like. But here's the problem. Angela is lacking some psychological coherency right now, for a variety of reasons. The almost getting hit by rocket thing among them. Everything is out of focus somehow. The sense that one of the rockets hit a pipeline that connects her to the culture in general, and that, as a result, she's not reading the same text as everyone else. Or the same subtext. It could be the war. Or it could just be the ritual. "Can you see this?" she asks, finally turning to face Horror. "Yeah," says Horror. "What about it?" "Is that really George Orwell? Am I really seeing this?" Horror shrugs. "I don't know anything more than 6 months old," she says. And Angela squints at her. "Why do I hang around you anyways?" she asks. "Unresolved sexual tension," says Horror. It's probably just a phrase she's heard somewhere. 0.08. Horror. Horror is a curious creature, and the most obvious curious thing about her is her name. Any real name she might have is unlikely to be revealed, and her reasons for choosing this one, if indeed it wasn't forced on her, are as difficult to analyze as the contents of her bloodstream. None of the things it immediately suggests seem to apply to her. Black really isn't her color, for one thing, and as awkward and contrary as she is, it's doubtful she would have been the kind of child whom parents affectionately see as a small, cute sort of horror. Not bad-looking in her way, but ungainly. In fact, unlike an Angela, she doesn't appear to have any interest in making an impression at all. Tonight she's dressed in her usual plain sleeveless t-shirt, plus baggy combat pants, worn more because they're easy to put on than a statement in military chic. The big, clunky black boots seem a half-hearted attempt to get taller. Horror's never been known to use the whole of her heart, which is far too busy keeping her plump blood moving around her slow, plump body. She has a faded tattoo on the flesh of her upper right arm, an animal that's only ever been identified with a shrug. Her hair's cropped short and dyed red. It's easy to imagine her being born that way. She also has a number of visible piercings. 1 stud in the side of her nose, 2 in her tongue, 1 in her eyebrow, and 3 in her ear. But again, there's that sense of why not about all of this. Horror, as an Angela well knows, is an expert at wandering through life. She has no sense of ritual and doesn't need a mission. She's happy to go along with most of what an Angela suggests. Drifts off on her own when she gets bored and says, "Huh," if she's not interested in the first place. An Angela has no idea where Horror got all the studs, but she imagines a whole series of men wandering up to her in a nightclub and saying, "Excuse me, can I stick this in your face?" And Horror replying, "Yeah, if you want," or "Yeah, if you want, I need a drink." Though she occasionally refers to boyfriends, and Angela's convinced that these man anecdotes are just things which came pre-formatted when Horror arrived in the world, since an Angela's never known her to show any bona fide signs of sexuality at all. That would require too much energy. Horror's magnetic. That's the truth of it. Wherever she goes, whatever environment she passes through, something will always stick. Put her in a war zone, and she'd slouch out of it unscathed, but wearing a bullet through each nipple. She'd sleep through a nuclear strike and wake up stoned from the radiation, shuffling off to the fridge with the post-Fallout munchies. She goes beyond Nietzsche's philosophy of whatever does not kill me makes me stronger, into a confusing new world of whatever does not kill me, I'll be shooting up by the end of the week. While an Angela's perpetually finding new projects to not quite finish, and new ways to redefine the world, Horror's never seems fully awake, even when she's driving. Especially not when she's driving. There should be a sign in the back of the van that says, "Caution, driver is generally not bothered." 0.09. The other side of the town. The last of the fireworks scatters itself over the heads of the crowd, shedding little red glowing particles from one side of the arena to the other. It's a cruel, cruel trick to play on an audience in a town like this, a town that's so often intersected, that's the only word for it, by the war. The first of the rockets went up just after midnight, just after the performing artiste, Miss Tiffany Corta, made her retreat from the stage at the end of the second encore. so the last thing she must have seen were the looks of shock on the faces of her semi-adoring public and semi-ironic public. Those of them who had visible faces, anyway. There are more masks every day. Callous insensitivity by the executive which arranged this performance? Possibly. Or possibly a deliberate flirting with danger. Most of the fireworks were, significantly, exactly the same tone of red as the average rocket attack. There's nothing remotely dangerous about Tiffany Corta. This girl with her big eyes and her animal blonde hair and her notoriously violent hip movements. Not on paper. She's never expressed a political opinion that might offend more than 3% of the target demographic. She's never been able to make a statement about the state of the modern world without beginning, well, you know, and yet she flirts. Or her image does. The occasional striking piece of grotesquerie in a video. The occasional strangely chosen fashion statement during a 2-song public appearance. T-shirt designs which might, if read through the correct filter of pop symbology, suggest something more. Enough to convince those who supposedly hate pure pop music that somehow she isn't as bad as the rest. Even the decision to stage a performance here, in the open air, is slightly off-key. A brilliant stroke on behalf of her executive. Unless, of course, there really is something strange going on. No, couldn't be. The crowd's old enough to know better, surely? So the pop diva vanishes, while the sky lights up in colors of shellfire, and everyone in the crowd jumps, then laughs, and goes home on edge anyway. Mostly this place is just a field. For 3 nights every 2 years, there's a world music festival here. The only thing for which this town is known in the outside world. Occasionally there are special one-off performances, but festival or one-off, the same thing happens. Great barriers go up around the field, forming a solid wall, like those huge wooden defenses around the Skull Island in King Kong. Since the barriers are woefully inadequate at keeping gate crashers out, and obviously wouldn't be much good at keeping in a runaway celebrity, it's likely that the people who first designed this layout had something similar in mind. Future generations will no doubt wish to clone giant versions of the pop stars who inhabit this territory, and get them to fight out their artistic differences within the perimeter. But for now, all the barrier can do is set out a kind of space. A town inside the town proper, which only exists for 1 night in 500. Alright then, more like Brigadoon than Skull Island. Inside the perimeter, the concessions. You'd expect burger stalls and hot dog vendors, and here they are. But this town in miniature specializes in the exotic. They do things with meat here that nobody would dare try in the outside world. The burgers are fried, not just with membrane-thin fragments of onion that disappear and become part of the atmosphere as soon as they hit the oil, but with red, peppercorn-tinted ingredients that have no parallel in the real world. These are the things your parents warned you not to eat. They can't be replicated beyond the walls of the arena. In fact, though neither the vendors nor the eaters realize it, these unheard-of spices and strange loops of deep-fried sausage aren't just ingredients. The tastes and the smells on offer here intersect this part of the world in the same way the war does. The heat of this particular night, the exact combination of fashions and factions in the crowd, the sweat on Tiffany Corta's body as she performed the inevitable ceremony of returning for two encores. Though nobody can read it, these are part of a system of thought, just like any town or town in miniature. The food only exists here and now. It's the key to unlocking this particular little pop culture space-time event. Taste is powerful in that way. .10. Tiffany. Tiffany Corta, as she appears on stage 10 minutes ago. 1. Hair. Dyed blonde. Dirt blonde. In such a way that all the world can see it's dyed. This should not, and does not, give the impression that this little Cuban girl is trying to hide her roots either literally or figuratively. The hair is shoulder length, with permanent waves making it mane-like and willfully ragged. It's precisely, deliberately engineered to look as if it's been left to run wild. The body language of certain dance routines is calculated to accentuate this, to make her movements seem feral, to turn her nails into weapons as well as fashion statement. She's Demeter in the wilderness, everything that's primal and ultimately irresistible. She's Shasta and Jane of the jungle. She's capable of sudden, predatory acts. 2. Top. In black leather, treated to give it the air of something bordering on the fetishistic. It has no arms, and it's laced together at the front. The majority of hetero males who saw this performance will go home remembering that she wore a corset, but the photographs of the event will insist that she's never been so cheap. Breasts are marginally visible between the laces, and bra straps are visible under the fabric on her shoulders, giving the impression that she's naked under the top, but leaving the after-image of black lingerie. The navel remains visible, as a matter of course. She's Sophia, the prostitute queen. She's all-knowing and skilled in the arts of the skin. She's the woman in red, and Mary Culver. She's professionally desirable. 3. Leather pants. It doesn't matter what country you're from. They're pants, not trousers. Skin tight at the top, but widening out as they reach her ankles, flared with patches of triangular fabric sewn into the cut seams. Non-blatant retro. It says history, that she's part of a tradition. The female part of the audience finds this reassuring. The pants prove, on some level, that this girl is not a slut. Covered legs are not entirely non-sexual, the low-level reminder that her ancestors had to fight to wear clothes like these back in the day when flares were the height of fashion. She's the goddess of the hunt. Her heritage is a heritage of quiet control. She's Black Aisha and Zarana, the warrior maiden. She's playfully dangerous. 4. Jewelry. A pin in the navel is obligatory. Diamond. A single glaring point of exotica. In addition, a second diamond-like stud in the forehead, also suggesting the exotic. It has overtones of an Eastern princess, not only establishing multiculturalism, but also a hint of royalty. The meaning of this third eye star is open to question, but not deeply rooted enough in the psyches of the audience for any unpleasant or sinister connotations to make themselves felt. The implication of preparation here goes largely unnoticed. Very few people in the world remember Around the World in 80 Days and the legend of the widow princess being thrown into the funeral pyre of the husband. 2 points of light on her body, one at the head and one of the stomach. She's a sacrifice. 0.11. Those closest. The girl on the pavement outside the amusement park is wearing a mask. The mask, like almost all of its kind, looks like bone, but can't possibly be. The mask, like almost all of its kind, looks like bone, but can't possibly be. The masks from the higher class boutiques and fetish emporiums are crafted to have the look of genuine, cracked-edge, hollowed-out animal skull, although this particular model is cheaper and polished to a white ceramic shine. This is the fashion, and has been ever since the words faction paradox became common currency. The rest of the girl's clothes suggest she's someone less fashion conscious. She has jeans and a t-shirt bearing an advertisement for a major clothing brand, as well as the flag of the country where that brand originated. The denim jacket lying on the pavement nearby. It's fair to assume she was carrying it. The mask looks fairly absurd without the jacket. The t-shirt and jeans are too slight, too much like items that she just threw on, so it's as though the bone mask has been stuck onto her face as an afterthought. Blonde hair framing it on all sides and sticking to the panic sweat on her neck. The girl, who remains nameless, has no obvious injuries. She's lying very still, though, breathing awkwardly, and her head is twisted to one side. The big black eyes of the mask turned forwards, the cracked but intact glass front of the arcade. The patterns of nearby debris tell the story. When the war intersected with the square, the shockwave ripped up several fragments of paving slab close to the impact point, and although none of the larger pieces got as far as the arcade, it's obvious that the girl was standing close to the epicenter at the time. One of the fragments was fired directly into her torso, throwing her across the pavement. If the shockwave wasn't already doing most of the work, and almost certainly cracking her ribcage. The lack of movement and interrupted breathing suggests there's additional internal damage. These casualties of war, people caught on the edge of the blast rather than being burned up at its core, are common. Oddly enough, they seem to attract slightly more press coverage than the rocket attacks proper. Perhaps it's because they're so much easier to photograph. Even so, only the police and Valentine's breed tend to get this close. It's one of those things which gives the war its air of abstraction. 0.12. In fact, Valentine exaggerates a little when he thinks of himself as being closer to the war than most. In truth, this is only the third time he's been called to a war site, and it's the first time he and Cause have arrived quite this early, before almost all the other crews. Though callouts are theoretically distributed between crews at random, every two-man team in town will invariably feel that they're deliberately given a kind of case, in addition to the standard heart attack victims which everybody gets. Valentine obviously hasn't been marked out for war duty by management. An hour ago, Valentine and Cause were at the Tiffany Court performance, the sarcastic quotation marks are his own, having parked the ambulance in the field outside the arena, a standard precaution whenever large numbers of hormonally charged people are gathered together in an environment likely to cause fainting, dehydration, and mild food poisoning. In the heat of the night, he and Cause spent most of the performance outside the ambulance, leaning against the side of the vehicle and watching the light from Miss Corta's huge video screens, making rapid cut flashes in the sky over the arena. When the big flash came as a sudden burst of red that must have burned itself into the blood cells of eyes for miles around, it took them a while to realize that it wasn't part of the light show. The thunder rumble of the impact was almost completely drowned out by the muffled bass line of a text-friendly song about living in... The thunder rumble of the impact was almost completely drowned out by the muffled bass line of a TXT-friendly song about living for you. It's doubtful that anyone inside the arena even noticed. "Fuck," says Cause, once he's finished blinking from the lightning flash, where he worked out what was going on. That was a rocket, wasn't it?" Valentine said. Even now, he's amazed that he could respond to any crisis by sounding quite so stupid. The war just isn't what they usually do. Ironic, given Valentine's particular interest in it, but there you go. In the end, they didn't start up the ambulance until Valentine prompted Cause with the seemingly unnecessary words, "We should go." Cause popped a couple of pills before they set off, and on the way, Valentine realized that, given what he had to do later on tonight, the rocket attack was pretty much an omen. Call it more synchronicity if you like, but his skin's been itching ever since. 0.13. Service. When Tiffany Corta gets back to her hotel room, there's nobody around but the attendant who opens the door for her. Bellboy is hardly the right term, since he lacks the comedy jaunty red hat that comes with the role, and he looks as if he's only working here while he's on break from art school. So he insists on making his plain white shirt look all puffy and romantic, new romantic. He looks anxious as Tiffany checks out her quarters, still in her leather pants and with the fake tan running off her body like sweat. Though she doesn't pick up on it straight away, the reason he's nervous is because he's not sure what the protocol is here and whether he should hope for a tip. He knows how rich she must be, even though money is as abstract a quality to her as distance. But he can never shake the feeling that, like royalty, she never carries cash. He's really quite perceptive. Excuse me. There are no members of the executive in the room. This is a good thing, Tiffany decides. At the end of the bed is a selection of televisions, each and every one wired up to a VCR. Some on the cabinet, some on the floor, one or two arranged on chairs. Screens and machines of all ages, scavenged from rooms around the hotel, one of them covered in grease and probably taken from the kitchen, some of them hooked up to the hotel's cable system, some of them supporting black, vicious-looking indoor aerials, all making up a web of electrical wiring which Tiffany somehow finds both reassuring and familiar. There are 14 of them in all switched on, and mercifully, they're all tuned, programmed, this isn't the 1960s, to the same channel, so that when they speak, you feel as though you don't have quite enough ears. It's like it's part of some colossal alien concept of stereo, for which humans aren't quite equipped. Where are the others? Asks Tiffany, with the usual twang in her voice. She doesn't take her eyes off the screen as she says it. The boy pauses before he says, The isn't leading to anything. He's hoping she'll interrupt him, ideally by shouting at him and making excessive demands. No doubt he's been able to deal with that, since he's seen pop stars on television. How many do you want? He asks once he realizes she isn't playing along. Another 8? Tiffany suggests. She's not taking her eyes off the screens, but in all honesty, she couldn't tell you what they're showing if you asked her. It's all just form and color, something red and explosive, but never mind the details. She's just making absolutely sure, that all the pictures really are identical. It's difficult, says the boy. We've taken all the sets from the empty room, but if you want more, then we'll have to ask the other guests, and they might not, She turns to look at him. She's not quite sure whether he's saying that he can't do it, or that he doesn't think it's a good idea. She wonders whether he wants something, and she briefly, only very briefly, considers offering him sex. She almost immediately concludes this isn't part of the protocol. Well, I need at least another 8, she says. More definitely this time. At least. 0.14. Pictures of birds and bees. Tiffany's reasons for not having sex with the boy have nothing to do with morality in the accepted sense of the word, and it goes without saying that it's not about attraction either. It's about reproduction in a specifically non-animal way. Lesser animals will have sex to recreate their DNA and spread it further afield, coupling with the strongest available mates to give their own flesh and blood the greatest possible chance. But humans, at least humans like Tiffany, are more complex. This is how the protocol works, at least as far as she's been able to understand it from the executive. Tiffany is in a theoretical bar. It's a fashionable bar. There'll always be reporters in this bar, or people who know reporters, or at the very least, members of the celebrity bloodline that we'll call homo imago. She makes contact with one of these others, male or female. It makes a difference, but both are feasible. Whatever display the two of them put on, it gets the attention of the rest of the bar. They might act as if they're planning to have sex. They might actually have sex, either in the toilets or elsewhere. This mating process, as a concept, if not a physical act, is captured by the observers and reported. Within 24 hours, images of both Tiffany and her mate will expand and proliferate throughout the world, taking precedence over the images of the rest of the Homo imago bloodline in just about every conceivable medium. Tiffany has done what any animal has to do. She's grown. She's acquired new mass, in the culture in general, if not in flesh and blood, although she's found there's an increasingly narrow divide between the two. Everything about her, or everything important about her, her face, her skin, her identity, all the things she represents, have been passed on, or mixed with the cultural DNA of her mate. Alternatively, she has sex with a nameless boy in a hotel room. Nobody sees it. Nobody's around to carry the image away with them. The boy tells his friends, and some of them believe him. And several months later, there are vague rumors in the press that Tiffany Corta likes to score a bit of rough when nobody's watching. It's a weak choice of mate. The next generation of herself is born lame and retarded. Occasionally, there'll be a surprise in the reproductive process. I hate this word. This word got me before in a previous book. Peculiarly. Peculiarly. Occasionally, there'll be a surprise in the reproductive process, and a peculiarly strong novelty birth will emerge from one of these couplings. But the executive has taught Tiffany that the results are far too unpredictable to take the risk. No sex tonight, then. .15. Closer. Not 0.15. 0.15. Closer. Less than an hour ago, Angela was sitting in an alleyway just off the square where the first of the night's rocket attacks eventually arrived. Because rocket attacks aren't launched anymore. They just arrive when they're damn good and ready. Angela left the area at 11:32, ambling past the unlicensed food counter, treating the sound of frying onions as if it were a round of applause from an audience of very small, very edible people. She met up with Horror at the House of Marrero just before 11:40. This was when the missile strike hit. This was when the missile strike hit the square. It is, as it happens, an experience to which human beings can adjust with very little difficulty. It's like lightning, really. The sense you get when the rockets hit the ground within 200 yards is the same as the sense you get when lightning strikes the tower block next door. When the noise and light really do happen at the exact same moment, just like you see in the movies. You're used to hearing rocket fire, but not that close. You're used to seeing the red powder burns in the sky, mostly from television, it's got to be said, but only as something distant, something abstract. Then suddenly it's hanging over you, uplighting the whole of the night, flashing on and off like an electrical storm. Horror's reaction was to swear, however laconically. And Angela was even more predictable. What could have been in that? But there's disappointment there. Longing, even. That's just it, you see. This war is everywhere, but it's an abstract thing. A friend of a friend war. Seeing the red glare bearing down on you, carried by the big pregnant rain clouds, is like seeing a celebrity while you're walking down the street. Everybody has stories about being there, about feeling the prickle of hot dust being sprinkled on their faces, although whether it's imaginary or a kind of fallout, nobody can say without knowing more about the weapons. Everyone's close to tonight's ground zero. Everyone close to tonight's Ground Zero must have felt the urge to ask the Impact for its autograph, or tell it looked smaller on television. I could have been in that. By which she means, Jesus, I could have been a lot closer to that if I'd known it was coming. I could have stood on the edge of the blast zone with my arms spread wide, letting the red light blaze across this mask in such a striking way. I could have felt that the war was real, just for this one night. Later on, she might tell people that she was closer than she actually was, the same as anyone else would. She'll definitely treat it like an omen. Assuming, that is, that nothing more interesting happens tonight. 0.16. Higher forms of life. The history of warfare is a history of increasing remoteness, a history of abstraction, even. This much is certain. Early-era warfare involves the cut and thrust of the melee, the constant jeopardy of the front line. Later, the invention of the firearms moves soldiers further and further apart, until the machine weapon finally makes full engagement impossible, while the creation of really slick, high fetishistic technology allows the exercise to be controlled from a different landmass. The myth being that attacks can be guided with precision, and that hardly anybody on the attacking side has to die that way. But those fighting this current war have a higher technology still. Well, of course they do. These great warriors who fight this war but are never seen. They're exotic, the distant and the powerful, the ones whom mere townsfolk can never aspire. The ones to whom mere townsfolk can never aspire. In this town, the people joke about their own inherent uselessness, about the fact that everything they do seems to somehow drab and parochial, that nobody from around here could ever be as slick or as glamorous or as fundamentally important as the people who make those shiny, dynamic, devastating rockets. Not that anyone's ever seen one of the rockets. This is what you really have to understand, if you're to understand towns like this one at all. You might wonder how these people can live with the war when they don't understand its nature, when they're not even wholly sure who's fighting it or what their objectives are. But the motives of their allies, stroke protectors, stroke partners in crime, are irrelevant. The name of the enemy is unimportant, because they understand, deep down, that this is simply the next stage of abstraction. A war so remote that even the shape of the battle remains obscure. The constant attacks and sporadic casualties may not be subtle, but you can be sure that the invisible, unknowable strategies behind them are subtle indeed. The locals no doubt feel that they're not qualified to understand such things. Perhaps the main problem is that nobody knows for certain what the wartime powers can do. Obviously everyone agrees they're technologically superior to anybody you might actually meet in the streets. Not that they're a wholly different kind of person, as such, but they must know things, and think things, and plan things beyond the usual state of comprehension. The fact that they can destroy virtually anything isn't open to question. Weather control has been suggested, but erratic weather was a feature of the local topography long before the war came to town. Right at the top of Spurious Claims chart, there's the suggestion of time-active warfare. The belief that the war is in some way being fought according to unfamiliar and non-linear timetables. But it's an established fact that time technology is impossible, and only the myth of faction paradox suggests otherwise. Which leads to the big question, of course. These supermen, these great empire builders, these wonderful people capable of fighting battles which intersect with the town in such a casual fashion. If they can destroy individual buildings from a distance of 1 billion trillion miles, or cause an individual to be struck down by lightning without ever leaving their homes, then why does the war exist at all? Why these rockets, these things which tear open the pavements and leave such huge gaping wounds in the sides of the pizzerias? Again, the only answer is that the war requires it. It's often said that the war is in some way about history, about the way it shapes the future, about the design it leaves imprinted on the face of the world. Why bomb the squares? Why send the missiles through the streets, burning away any pedestrian or vehicle that might get in the way? Because otherwise, how would anybody know there was a war at all? .17 Complete Sync. Cause being short for Connell, being Valentine's long-term partner on the night shift, is on the other side of the square, not far from the Wounded nightclub, caught in the on-and-off light of the red neon sign. Valentine instinctively glances in Cause's direction as he hurries to the injured girl's side. Cause looks tired, which might not be surprising for someone in his line of work, but it's significantly out of his character. Cause is better known amongst his college for his bursts of frantic, uncontrollable hyperactivity, a cause for concern, especially when it involves him threatening bystanders who get in the way or, as on one occasion, throwing a steel litter bin through the window of a car after an argument with its driver. Right now, though, he looks a lot like an alcoholic who's just realized that he hasn't been able to walk straight for the last 10 years. His balding, ape-like head is bowed low, and he stands in the red flicker light, one hand massaging his eyeballs in their sockets, swaying on his legs like the big bronze man in Jason and the Argonauts. Any further description is unnecessary. The apparent reason for his weariness is that nearby, on the edge of the crater, 2 policemen are physically restraining an obvious drunk. The obvious drunk has another obvious drunk as a friend and confidant, but obvious drunk number 2 is sitting on the ground with one leg torn open, sometimes swearing at the policemen and sometimes asking them for help. Cause is apparently waiting for the situation to resolve itself before he checks the fallen man's injury. That's the apparent reason. Valentine knows better. But closer to hand is the girl in the mask, and she's not moving. Strictly speaking, Valentine should be reassuring her at this point, telling her not to worry, just in case she turns out to be conscious. He can't really bring himself to do it. He starts to scrape the sweat-matted hair away from the sides of her head, revealing the strap that keeps the mask on. It's probably not the mask that's stopping her breathing properly, but you never know. At this point, she stops breathing. Valentine panics, understandably. Obviously, he's done the training, but the unofficial protocol of the profession demands that the more experienced and more middle-aged member of any 2-man crew should be the one to perform the vital last-minute life-saving work. Which is why, training or no training, Valentine's first reaction is to shout, "Cause!" Across the square, Cause doesn't appear to hear him. He's too busy telling a policeman, in a rather disinterested and lackluster way, not to move the injured obvious drunk. "Cause!" Valentine shouts again, but he's already moving to perform the emergency procedures on the girl himself. At this point, and without warning, she starts breathing, all on her own. At exactly the same moment, behind the glass in front of the amusement arcade, the little devil machine lights up with a little red sign that says, "Get lucky." 0.18 Decorum. A girl was killed here in town a few days ago. Not killed as a consequence of war, which isn't unusual, or killed in a traffic accident on one of the many, many ring roads and thoroughways, which isn't unusual either. No, the girl was murdered, and the murder was brutal, and the locals were shocked, and even the newspapers outside the town took notice, if only for a while. The killer hasn't been identified, nor does it seem likely that he ever will be. He is more or less a certainty, since even though the killing lacked an overt sexual meaning, it still had that sense of violation that smacks of male lust, dirty bedsits, and obsessive behavior. The murder is not, in itself, significant. There is no sense of sacrifice, no ritual pattern, and it's highly improbable the killer will strike again, say, tonight. The girl was 14 years old, and, as far as anyone can ascertain, had no secrets deeper than you'd expect. Cigarettes, mild doses of alcohol, at least one night spent kissing more than one 15-year-old boy, etc. She had no special interests, liked 2 of Tiffany Corta's 8 singles, but generally preferred Waco Black, and was ambivalent on the topic of faction paradox masks. And yet, the girl outside the amusement arcade, with her stylized pseudo-faction mask and her obvious need to stand out against the night, reminds Valentine of the murdered girl, or of the news story of the murdered girl, which is as intimate as it gets. A skull with no jaw and no teeth, too self-confident even to laugh. There's no direct correlation between a butchered child and a teen club-goer with an interest in neo-goth chic, but in light of recent events, there's something disrespectful about all of this. Even Valentine gets a twinge of it, and he knows he should know a damn sight better. He also knows that the brother and sisterhood between the people who wear the masks is a fragile one, held together by fashion and prone to collapse if they're spat at in the street. No real revolutionary would go masked. That's the lesson. 0.19. Even so, notice one thing here. Valentine was just about to remove the girl's mask, just out of procedure, when she suddenly stopped breathing. During the period of panic that follows, he makes no attempt to finish what he started, to hurriedly tear the mask away from the girl's face. He's already started to think that it belongs there. Perhaps because the echo of her breathing, scraping against the inside of the bone-faced polymer, is so much easier for him to hear if he leaves the mask on. Or perhaps because he spent so much time in the ambulance fitting oxygen masks to the sick and gasping, it seems only natural for the girl to have something over her mouth, as if she's brought her own life support equipment. 0.20. Traces of nuts. And Angela is standing in front of the chocolate rack at the stopover, or possibly not, since her time perception is verging on the mysterious, and she's got the feeling that it's taking much longer than usual for the outside world to make an impression on her. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that she's standing in front of the chocolate counter right now. Alchemists, Kabbalists, witches, wannabes, fakirs, fakers, and pedants of all descriptions. There's nothing they like more than catalogues of demons. Is that why they really spent all that time in those darkened rooms? Is that why they filled their basements with fumes guaranteed to rot the nervous connections of the brain, or stuffed themselves with specially coded poisons, or locked themselves away until the loneliness and self-flagellation made them hallucinate? Is that why they pushed themselves on, and on, and on, hoping to come across one more species of daemon, one more variety of guardian angel? Not because they believed the next apparition could have all the answers, but just because they wanted to collect the set? Now, Angela's a completionist, even though she regularly changes her mind about what she needs to complete. She's tried sugar, caffeine, high-fat diets, and booze in absurd quantities. She's tried drinks that ostensibly make you go blind, but don't. Drinks that require you to suck a special kind of worm in advance, and drinks that apparently only work if you perform a precise ritual of setting them on fire and then performing a special dance. She's tried treating She's tried treating every different pizza topping as another kind of sacrament. She was hoping that Each one of these would provide her with contact with one of the greater powers of existence, so that she could name it and check it off. And none of these things can be considered an absolute failure, even if she's never seen the demons so far. Every substance you take into your body is a ritual substance. Chocolate? It deals in serotonin, adjusts the balance of your biology, does things to a woman that only nature is supposed to understand. Just think of those alchemists, with all their elemental poisons and all the codes they kept for all their best ingredients. Idiots. You could get the same result with 22 iterations of chocolate available right here on the racks of the stopover. Each one dressed in its own colors, covered in its own symbology, marked with its own warnings and credos. May contain traces of nuts, suitable for vegetarians. To say nothing of the icons. Little corporate symbols, stylized rune letters, and animal-faced people. Every cartoon character, the avatar of something larger, because all snacks bring forth demons, even if they're just the kind you get from glucose and hyperactivity. There are those who say that ritual requires ancient knowledge, and Angela couldn't care less about ancient knowledge. She knows what ritual really is, on a purely instinctive level, and that's why she's already made precise plans for this evening. Plans which start right here, in a stopover on the very most northern edge of the town, the furthest you can go before civilization gives way to darkness, where there's no electric lighting and no services for another 20 miles along the road. .21 on chocolate. Ah, yes, chocolate was established as the definitive substance of witchcraft in the 1700s, when cacao was spreading across the Western world like the next big thing, and the line between rational and the ritualistic was even shakier than it is at this exact moment in time. This annoys Angela, who feels she has an instinctive understanding of the ritual use of chocolate, and objects to the idea that she's got anything in common with a bunch of witches, let alone a bunch of antique witches who are probably prostitutes anyway. And Angela is not a witch. Nor does she believe in anything remotely spiritual, because that would be stupid and clumsy and embarrassing. What she is, however, which is to say what she calls herself, is a ritualist. Admittedly, this leads her to doing things which even the Wicca contingent would find upsetting, but there's a major difference which will no doubt make itself clear in time. Now, there's one thing that in Angela grudgingly admits about the alchemists and elementalists of the past. She respects their pedantry. This might seem odd, especially since she herself is quite evidently ready to change her mind about any important point within the space of minutes, but there's a logic here. She loves catalogs. She loves boxes in shoe shops that are lined up according to bright primary colors. When she was a child, mail-order catalogs were where toys came from, each big-eyed piece of collectible plastic having its own number and its own secret code. When she ran smack into puberty, catalogs were where clothing came from, and much of the same thing applied, except with overtones of sex, glamour, and adulthood. And now the protocols of faction paradox have very nearly become a fashion statement in themselves. Faction paradox. That legendary underground fashion conspiracy. Faction paradox, with its complex chain of rituals, procedures, histories, counter-histories, ranks, orders, bestiaries, icons, codices, catalyst, and nonce words. Faction paradox, which, most of all, sees all these processes as being almost infinitely mutable, or so it's said. That's it. That's the key to understanding an Angela. She could spend hours making lists and inventories of things she owns, things she wears, or things she's just invented, and then rip up the lists in a moment of pique. She hates having to remember things, and the alchemists had the right idea. Whole volumes of mystical ingredients, full of symbols and ciphers, as meaningless and as glorious as mail-order product numbers. And no two ever agree on the exact relationship between black crow and red mercury, or grey dog and white lightning. Mysticism reinvents itself, day by day, hour by hour. The lists are never the same twice. Once an Angela has a ritual to perform, be it in the name of greater truth or the correct application of makeup, she'll stick with it. Some people, those who tend to side with one lifelong religion or party, would say this is because she's secretly very unhappy and needs meaning in her life. Like, fuck. She has meaning. If anything, she's got too much meaning, and she'll reinvent more of it at a moment's notice, reading every shift in chic as an omen, or treating every event in her life as a crucible of the truth. She insists on making her nails. She insists on making her mark in the world, in spray paint or nail varnish. She knows what that mark has to be with a near visionary certainty. She's 19 years old. She has a right to this. That's why she's designed the ritual, the initiation, which has now brought herself and horror to the northern edge of the town. But the preparation for this particular ritual was a long and hazardous process, and it'll stretch her faculties to the full. Already she's finding it unusually hard to concentrate. Unusually, given that tonight she hasn't consumed anything more than 3.5% by volume. Oh, that's better. 0.22. Wonderful people out there in the dark. A lot of people in the crowd were wearing faction paradox. A lot of people in the crowd were wearing faction paradox masks, of one kind or another. In retrospect, Tiffany remembers most of them wearing masks, but she knows it can't possibly be true. The bony faces with their snouts and their big wide eyes are just a lot more noticeable than the usual human eye-nose-mouth arrangement. Porcelain heads lit up by the dull red glow of the fireworks. Some of the masks were smooth enough, slick enough to be mass-produced. But some of them looked a lot like paper mache. The idea being that as faction paradox is supposedly an underground movement, you don't have to buy officially licensed merchandise to be part of it, and your own homemade attempt at a faction fetish is good enough. Tiffany isn't sure how she feels about that. It doesn't seem proper somehow. Her Catholic upbringing tells her that it lacks the sense of official blessing. It's difficult to say what styles the other members of the crowd were wearing, the ones whose dark, forgettable faces hovering around the bone masks in the pretend rocket light. It's difficult even to make guesses. Tiffany's executive have made sure she isn't tied to any one particular fashion/demographic group. So although it tries to give a general impression of her that she's the top 40 pop star, although it tries to give a general impression of her that she's the top 40 pop star that it's okay to like if you're a rocker or a retro kid, she can't be seen in any of the relevant uniforms. This is, as the executive knows, in the nature of the times. Faction paradox is spreading as an aesthetic, as a movement, because no one form of culture is attached to it. Tiffany, who wouldn't be seen dead in any kind of mask, although in one video she did wear white geisha makeup, which might have been interpreted as following the bat skull pattern, is an all-purpose icon. It's her duty to be all things to all people. Once the video recorders and TV screens she's requested arrive in her hotel room, she'll replay the night's event and cast one eye over the fashion senses of the crowd in the hope of divining something significant from it. But it won't take long for her other eye to get distracted, because, as it happens, the tapes of her performance contain something which will interest and alarm her a great deal more. 0.23. Note: it doesn't take much to alarm Tiffany, for a number of reasons. 1. Her lifestyle is such as it is. 1. Her lifestyle is such that her executive shifts her from place to place, city to city, nation to nation, event to event, on a pretty much daily basis, spiriting her away, apt word, that, according to its own plans and calculations. The astrology of demographics and public opinion. This means she exists in a permanent sense of dislocation, a perfectly reasonable way for a human being to live, but not something that gels well with most people's view of civilization. In short, she panics if she sits still for too long. 2. Cocaine. This isn't remotely shocking. You can take it as read, unless there's hard evidence to the contrary, that any face regularly seen on television will have had cocaine fed into it at some point recently. In fact, cocaine isn't the overriding reason for Tiffany's general state of edginess, but it can't exactly be helping. 3. The nature of her relationship with the executive itself, which would spook just about anybody. Let's be honest. It's tempting to call their arrangement Faustian, but the contract wasn't signed in anything as startling as blood, and so far the executive has shown her nothing but goodwill. Besides, if Tiffany were just a little more culture-aware, then the idea of a pop star entering a pact with demons would sound altogether too much like a 70s rock opera. If she's done a deal with anything, it's with the culture in general. But the executive still freaks her out anyways. 4. Wait and see. 0.24. Distracted. For the last few minutes, the girl has been breathing, then not breathing, then breathing, then not breathing. Valentine, who falls into these little wartime superstitions faster than he might like to admit, has found himself believing that her lungs are in some way linked to the invisible, unpredictable pattern of the square itself. That if the blinking lights, the electrical currents, and the shouts of the firefighters all sync up, then everything will start working properly, the girl's internal organs included. He still hasn't removed the girl's mask, and he's starting to realize, consciously, that it's helping him make sense of the situation. The irregular beat of her breathing, the hissing, crackling noise behind the fake bone, the long, awkward pauses. Cause has arrived by now, having given up on the wounded drunk, but his presence isn't exactly helping. He stands over the fallen girl, still swaying a little on his legs, with so many folds of saggy flesh around his eyes that Valentine wonders if all the weight from the man's thighs has ended up settling in his eyeballs instead. Cause looks awful. It's been a long, long day for him. Now, Valentine's trying to make it clear that he's looking up at his partner expectantly, waiting for suggestions, but Cause isn't taking the hint. Indeed, he doesn't yet seem to have identified the mass of skin, hair, and artificial fibers in front of him as a human being at all. I can't do anything, Valentine points out, hoping to get a reaction. Something's got to be damaged. She's trying to breathe, but listen. Yeah, says Cause. That's all. Just, yeah. So we better get her to casualty, Valentine tries. In fact, right now, a run to the hospital isn't exactly what he needs, but he doesn't exactly have a choice. Right, says Cause. By the time Valentine looks up again, Cause has already turned away and started walking back across the square, towards the side street where the ambulance is parked. Valentine has no option but to follow. Cause has the muscles of a man who spent half a lifetime lifting the lame and fighting off angry relatives, and on most nights he'd easily be able to single-handedly lug a stretcher from the ambulance to the pavement outside the arcade. But, right now, Valentine isn't inclined to let his partner out of sight. It's by no means certain that by the time Cause reaches the ambulance, he'll remember what he went for. Valentine strokes the girl's hair one more time before he goes, hoping to God that from the outside it doesn't look creepy or disturbing. He mumbles a, "It's going to be all right," to her as he walks away, although, in all honesty, he's talking about much bigger things than just her own health. 0.25. Both Aries. Valentine is not, in the conventional sense of the word, superstitious. Of course, he believes certain things which he knows, rationally, anyway, to be completely untrue. Like every other human being, he secretly believes he's the center of the universe, meaning that he's the lead character in the great universal narrative. He knows that in the grand scheme of things, he's nothing but dust, a very, very small collection of bits and pieces set against the overwhelming weight of the world, but obviously this isn't a thought he likes to dwell on. The superstition that anything you do makes any kind of sense on the grand scale is only right and proper. It's ridiculous, impossible, great and unarguable superstition which makes the whole of humanity possible. In Valentine's case, there's the smallest of differences in that he's unusually aware of it because he's been giving things a greater than average amount of thought recently. He's not a person who takes things casually, as is his own appearance accepted. However, in the more mystical sense of the word superstitious, no, not at all. Cause, on the other hand, is the kind of person who sees the astrology section as being the core of any newspaper, the all-important center page around which the other news story revolves. Valentine has the sneaking, dreadful feeling that when he's been riding ambulances as long as Cause, he will have absorbed so many death anecdotes and last breath pieces of wisdom that he'll be just the same. If one dying woman tells you she foresaw the date of her death, then it's a coincidence. But the trouble with being a crewman is that you're exposed to a damn sight more of those coincidences than just about anyone else. It's bound to get you. It's bound to get to you, eventually. All of which assume he's going to live through the rest of the night. But his horoscope from the sun for the next 23.5 hours, as it was read to him by Cause in the hospital rec room earlier on, once the worst is over, don't worry. Everything will be solved in one moment of clarity. 0.26. Enough tape. Tiffany has her televisions now. She turned the sound down on all of them, something which took some time as it required her to work out how to use the 22 different sets of controls. It was only once she'd finished that Danzeo arrived, causing the hotel boy to make an immediate retreat, saying, "Well, if there's anything you need, just," in the language of shrugging. Technically, Danzeo is a member of the executive. You can tell that just by looking at him, and it's enough to scare off most people. On this occasion, Danzel blatantly enjoyed sliding into the room, his face, such as it is, slowly appearing round the side of the half-open door, the sinister edge marred a little by the 2 fully stuffed carrier bags in his hand. He's the only one that Tiffany would trust with this errand. He's part of the executive, yes, and she's got a duty to defy the executive's less important orders. It's part of her role as a pop icon, and the executives occasionally come close to telling her as much to her face. But she has difficulty imagining Danzeo telling the other executive members anything at all. He's only in this for the kicks. although, judging by his voice, he's old enough to know better. Orders or no orders, he'll indulge in any little corruption that comes his way, which technically means Tiffany shouldn't trust him with any task, but never mind that now. By now, Danzales closed the door behind him, shut out the rest of the world, and emptied out the carrier bags onto the floor, forming a great, ungainly heap of black and white plastic. Videotapes, several dozen of them. Tiffany's already feeding them into the VCR machines and winding through them one by one. Danzale lurks at the back of the room, in close orbit of the minibar. "I had to go through a lot of trouble to get these, you know," he says. He sounds amused. Possibly he's thinking of asking for a bonus. Tiffany grunts, but not in the sexy way that she usually does to mark the end of a chorus. "Don't you know all the TV people?" she asks. Most of these aren't official recordings. They were taken by the crowd." "Oh, are they allowed to do that?" Danzale doesn't respond to this. Tiffany gets the feeling that he's raising an eyebrow behind the mask. Of course they're not allowed to do that. But they're helping with her reproductive process, so it's not as if the executive would have any reason to stop them. In fact, the other members will probably be disappointed that Tiffany's had all the tapes hijacked, but in the scheme of things, these few images can't represent more than 1/billionth of her current overall mass. .27. The House of Marrero. The House of Marrero is parked outside in the forecourt of the stopover. Its great, ugly mass sinking into the tarmac at an odd angle, thanks to the unpredictable suspension. Black tarmac that's currently splattered with blood. Actually far less sinister than it sounds, but we'll come to this. For the record, the van was third hand, and looked third hand when horror got a hold of it. Half of the black paint was already there. The other half was a result of an abortive attempt to make the machine shiny again. The half-used paint canisters are still in the back. Now, Inangela isn't a great one for machines. Like most of her generation, she enjoys using technology because when she was a child, she was told that in the future there would be technology. She hates vinyl LPs because they remind her of crushed animals, likes compact discs because they're shiny and silver and look like things that astronauts use to cook dinner, and is awaiting the day when she can plug music recordings straight into her spinal column or something. But the technicalities of these things are of no interest to her at all, and, let's be honest, she gets bored easily anyways. She likes to use whatever comes to hand. So she's not the kind of person who habitually does things like giving names to vehicles, especially since the House of Marrero is technically owned by Horror rather than Inangela herself. Horror has no decent surname, and the House of Horror is a terrible name for a car under any circumstance. But this van is more than transportation. It's a birthright. Although neither Inangela nor Horror are planning on having children ever, they still harbor thoughts of gaining some kind of junior offspring. Maybe. Horror has suggested. Maybe, Horror has suggested, we could grow something in a bowl and stamp it on when we get fed up. Then showing it the house. I'll try this again. We could grow something in a bowl and stamp on it when we get fed up. Then, showing it the house and say, "Someday, child, all of this will be yours." Don't think that's the right voice for Horror. And Angela likes the idea of having a birthright, of having a family seat. She's an aristocrat at heart, just a very poor one who has no compunction about leaving snack wrappers on the floor of her mobile, four-wheeled, one-indicatored estate. It's good to have a family seat that can scare the shit out of the ordinary people by taking tight corners at 80 miles per hour and making really big screeching noises. 0.28. Inventory of items purchased from the stopover. 4 pies, or pie-shaped things. The stopover sells them wrapped in plain paper to give them that handmade feel, something which an Angela appreciates. 4 is probably excessive, though. For one confused moment, she wonders what's in the fourth of the 4 pies, briefly believing that the other 3 contain frog, pig, and bear. 5 pepperoni sticks. Yes, 5. Horror likes these. Each wrapper has a curiously mystical-looking cartoon eye printed on the side, and an Angela considers it odd that a meat-based product should advertise itself with animal parts that really shouldn't be contained in the sticks themselves. This makes her imagine animals harvested specially for their eyes, perhaps looking like the many-eyed thing from the Book of Revelations, which once again makes her wonder what the fourth of the animals is, and the Muppets are singing. It's very distracting. 2 packets of caffeine pills, and Angela now feels much more focused. Musical numbers notwithstanding, she doesn't even have any to take. She doesn't even have to take any. She just has to know she can. A magazine, the cheapest one available. It's traditional. 1 chocolate bar, which slides neatly into an Angela's coat pocket, right next to the single sleeveless videotape she's carrying. 0.26. Last spin of the wheel. By the time the fire crews arrived to put out the blaze in the South American restaurant, the upper floor was already flambéed in the four-star fire. Oh God. By the time the fire crews arrived to put out the blaze in the South American restaurant, the upper floor was already flambéed in the 4-star style. Distracted by the fire at the front of the building, nobody paid enough attention to the fire spreading down the rear stairs or checked the building's gas and electrical points. So when the building explodes, it's something of a surprise, given that from the outside it looks as if the fire's nearly out. The explosion carries most of the building's contents, furniture, food supplies, dishwasher parts, and refrigerator doors, along with it. Most of the material burns up, very briefly filling the square with the hit of 1,000 kinds of exotic flesh before the sensation's blotted out by smoke and ashes. All that survives is kitchen-shaped shrapnel. Valentine and Cause are outside the arcade when it happens. They've been attempting to move the girl in the mask onto a stretcher. Valentine not wanting to touch any part of her body in case it makes her stop breathing for good. Cause handling her as if she were a corpse already. But up until this point, their attempts have been as awkward as erratic as her breathing. Now, all of a sudden, there are pieces of burning debris cracking open the pavements, and there's no time for politeness. Clumsily, but quickly, the girl gets hoisted into the stretcher, and to hell with the consequences. They haul her off the ambulance, and she chokes 3 times behind the mask, and then falls silent. 0.30. The lay of the land. Father Danzale is standing on the roof of the hotel. Not exactly at the dead center of the town. The architecture isn't that convenient, symbolically speaking, but as close as you can get, while still retaining a good view. People have a tendency to do this, when they want to feel they're addressing the culture in general. The truth is that if you were to stand on top of the tallest building that ever existed, you'd be able to see such a small percentage of the culture in general, or rather, its outward skin-of-the-world signs, that you might as well stay on the ground. But height is important to human beings. No primal challenge was ever won by an ape who couldn't climb rocks. And besides, is there that lurking need to try and read the skin of the world? The sense that you'll be able to make out those mystical, geological, faux random patterns down at ground level? Almost certainly, especially if you have to be slightly drunk, as is Father Danzale. From here, you can From here, all you can really see are ring roads in white light, tower blocks lit by unreadable sequences of lit, unlit, unlit, lit, lit, unlit windows. Ad hoardings lit by half-interested lamps that only show the top halves of the product names. Looking at it from here, you'd never believe there was any kind of greater culture at work below the streets. You see small patches of territory, some owned by individuals, some owned by corporations, some owned by the public, jostling with each other to fill the space. A natural selection of geography. Territory. It's all about territory. All wars are. When you're young and you're taught the storybook version, told that wars begin when the princess of Micronesia... When you're young, you're taught the storybook version, told that wars begin when the prince of Micronesia insults the duchess of Grand Fenwick, or when King A covets the wife of King B and sends armies to their deaths in order to capture her. But no war was ever fought that way. It's all about land. Always. Even when race and religion are there to provide the window dressing, Helen of Troy was not a great-looking woman. The king of Sparta needed her as his wife in order to legitimize his claim to the throne. No idiot would have gone through all that busyness with the horse otherwise. All wars are about land. Until now, and except for this war, so great that it exists in the singular, so fundamental the space in which it exists is virtually irrelevant, it manifests itself here just to prove its existence. Father Danzeo, meanwhile, is part of a group which has its own definition of territory. Not that he has any real reason for surveying this part of the world from up here, other than the fact that he's had half a bottle of something complimentary and needs to clear his head. So he tips his head back, opens his nostrils, and breathes in. He's wearing the mask that befits a senior member of the executive, obviously, but he can still suck in air from across the townscape. It smells of cordite and garlic. 0.31. The Runaway. Danzeo's left the room now, possibly in search of prostitutes, or just young women whom he can falsely promise to put in Tiffany's personal retinue, assuming he's a heterosexual, that is. Hard evidence is thin on the ground. This leaves Tiffany with a maximum of 22 copies of herself, although at any one time she'll be missing from 5 or 6 of the screens as the cameramen in the crowd zoom in on the backing bands of the scenery or the backs of their girlfriends' heads. She has no idea whether her performance was any good. The sound's still down on the TV sets, and her numerous image selves have become abstract quantities, collections of poses and pouts which she no longer sees as being recordings of her own flesh. Her eyes slip from screen to screen, trying to lock the images together, to superimpose and assemble. Cocaine helps make your eyes move fast. What she's actually doing, though she'd have trouble vocalizing it, is trying to see the performance from all 22 angles at once, looking for what might be called continuity errors. The hardest part was syncing up all of the tapes, so that exactly the same moment is always playing across the screens, and she's done a pretty good job, as any lapses aren't more than a split second in length. The executive could probably provide her with a special machine for this, but she knows it wouldn't be wise to ask. Sometimes, one tape or another rapidly skips out of time, as someone in the audience stops his camcorder during one of the slow numbers to go and get a hot dog. There. For a brief moment, she was on all the screens at once. She lifts her arms into the air on stage, revealing one sweat-soaked armpit to the audience, something which she's been told triggers an instant sexual response in something % of the hetero-male audience. Arms still in the air, she turns a little to the camera's right, a little to her left, a little away from the band, a little towards the group of faction wannabes at the front of the audience pit, frames herself in the light from the burger concession. All of these things are true, depending on which screen you're looking at. She snaps her head straight to her right, She looks away from the camcorder owner with the shaky hands on the far edge of the arena. Seems to be turning her nose up at the faction bunch, giving the TV camera at the backstage a good chance for a butt shot. Hold on. Head to the right. Looking away from the arena's edge. No, that makes sense. Wait though. Head to the right. Looking over the heads of the faction people. She tries to focus on the same 5 cameras, but the images are running away from each other. One of the 5 is meaningless as the camcorder owner goes in searching for a usable toilet. The other flickers onto the others flicker onto other things. The official TV camera has moved from her backside to her drummer. Maybe it's the cocaine talking, but it seems pretty clear to her that something is wrong here, that it's finally happened, that just for a second, one of those images wasn't her. And if that's true, then does the executive know? And does the executive care? And was the executive responsible? And is it really her executive anyways? And then there's a knock at the door. I'm just going to step away for a brief moment to refill my water. The whole one of you who's listening, I'm sure, can handle my disappearance for a moment. Thank you for your patience. .32, ground level, 1. Patterns on the ground. It's all about the patterns on the ground. Insects can leave scent trails behind them, marking out complex, unconscious structures in the dirt, tracing the shape of all the ground they own. Even mammals feel the need to ceremonially urinate occasionally. But human beings are better than piss and formic acid. Human beings, have culture, understand shape, understand symbols. Nobody ever believes it when they see the landscape from the air and see the shapes that were put there by their ancestors. The strange astrologies, the lines of force, the stillborn animal shapes on the ground that can take on new eyes, new limbs, and new cancers with the building of every new road or tower block. Nobody believes that people who could fly would tear scars across the fields in the shapes of dream images and mystery creatures. Because you never notice the thing on the ground until it swallows you. Why would the ancients go to all this bother? Could they levitate? Wrench themselves out of their bodies with drugs and look down at the finished work? What's the point? The point is obvious. They all believed giants were in the ground. They had to mark out the territory, to overwrite the things that might have been there already, the footprints left by those there before them, or those lying in wait under the soil who still might write secret, invisible curses among the roots. They had to write big, the ancients. As soon as they could write, they knew they had to write big. It's all about territory. Even now. Look at this town, with its ring roads and its shocking red warning signs. See how the corporations and the homeowners and the town planners and the renegade builders all try to write bigger than each other inside the great bloody pentagon of its perimeter? One great urban zoology, so that you never know where one beast ends and the next begins. Are you really doubting, even for a second, that there really are things buried under a town like this? You know it instinctively, in a way that only an anthropologist could ever explain and only a ritualist could ever exploit. You've found yourself walking in patterns without knowing why. You've driven around the curves of the overpass once more for good luck, just to make sure you've drawn the route properly. Patterns in the ground. Not as simple as they used to be. Valentine, for instance, is one of the few who's tried to keep track of this war, who's tried to make sense of the strategy in the blast sites and the lines between the attack craters, and he knows it's just turning into a kind of divination, and it's a depressing thought. The war writes itself across the world in letters big enough to make him feel helpless, to make the whole of the town and the whole of the world feel helpless. And maybe that's the point. But that's just one perspective. There are others. For example, pardon me, I'm just making a slight adjustment. I'm putting some drops in. My eyes are starting to strain a bit. It's alright. It's the price of reading. Example 0.33. Ground level 2. It is in Angela who is perhaps the most conscious of patterns in the ground, and she's certainly the one who spends the most time wondering what might lie in wait underneath it. Like many of her exotic beliefs, this comes from childhood. Children really are very good at getting involved in the world's more visceral rituals. Most adolescent rituals are about destruction, tearing things up, burning them down, blowing them apart, if possible. At least, this is the way Angela remembers life as a 12-year-old. Leaving aside the polite, middle-class life on the inside of the house, with all its lists and catalogues, in her mind, her later childhood was a garden of fires, smoke clouds, a pack of giggling, sadistic, elf-like children moving half-seen through the streets in the dead of night, of darkened landscapes made up of bits and pieces salvaged from scrapyards, broken doors that led nowhere, propped up against stacks of bricks, burning rubbish and scorched, hostile, haunted tree roots. The children steal a car, drive it to the edge of the estate in the near dark, then make a Guy Fawkes man out of spare parts from the tip and put the bucket-headed figure in the driver's seat. They name it after someone they hate, always an authority figure, usually a teacher at the local school. These little pubescent tribal destroyers, claiming to be beyond all the rules, still think enough of their supposed lords and masters to want to kill teachers instead of anything more dangerous. Ultimately, of course, they set fire to it, often sending the homunculus teacher into the afterlife with a whole host of parting gifts. Anything from the tip that might reduce the pretend man's dignity further, any stolen items they might want to dispose of before dawn. The ritual, which Angela remembers most, and in which she herself was involved rather than being a mere spectator, was the theft of the neighborhood watch signs. This was later. She was 15 or so. By age 15, you have a sense of irony. Stealing neighborhood watch signs, the ultimate smart-arsed tribal custom, a far more powerful act than more mundane boy gang initiation of nicking porn mags from the news agents. Neighborhood watch signs make people feel slightly more comfortable. They're like holding glyphs, and holding glyphs have to be placed with precision. You can't rein in a demon by almost surrounding it with the appropriate symbols. 6 signs removed and or destroyed by an Angela's pack. 6 cracks in the safety pattern that kept the town secure. 0.34. Flexing. It was around this point that an Angela began to consciously notice what all urban human beings suspect. That there was definitely and profoundly something under the ground. That the warding glyphs and holding glyphs were keeping it in place, pinning it down, reining in the beast. That now the pattern was incomplete, the great urban horror could, well, perhaps not escape, but certainly flex a muscle or two. Begin moving towards the ground, extending a claw to write something on the underside of the town's skin. Write curses. And not 5 years later, the town ended up being caught in the crossfire of a monumentally destructive and inexplicable war, almost as if something had summoned it there, in the hope, perhaps, that the rockets would tear open some more key points in the town's structure and let the great urban horror go free. Which would technically make the war in Angela's fault, wouldn't it? .35, ground level 3. And then there's Tiffany Corta. Tiffany is different. Tiffany has less appreciation of the concept of space than anyone else around here, and perhaps that's less than surprising. Her executive would offer one explanation. They'd point out that as Tiffany exists in so many places at once, her image and identity spread over videotapes and digital recordings all over the human world, the original version is bound to feel a kind of dislocation and become, well, maybe not omnipresent, but getting there. On the other hand, you could argue Tiffany doesn't understand space properly just because she's conditioned not to. Her sponsors, patrons, managers, and advisors move her from scene to scene at a whim, from one stage to the next, never letting her see anything in between. No traveling, other than the nonsense of private air transport. During the first Gulf War, it was said that several American celebrities were too scared to fly to public appearances in Europe because of the threat posed by the conflict. Nobody understood this, until somebody in Europe realized that to them, everywhere that wasn't America was the same place. Space folds in on itself, and the shell fire over Kuwait superimposes itself over the sky in London. And Tiffany, who already sees herself as being flattened and spread out across the information superhighway, she's raised the art of not being anywhere to new heights. But she does see the patterns, and she does see connections, of a kind. She knows about the inner sanctum of her reward company, of her record company. She thinks of it as the temple headquarters of the executive, even though it really only exists as a series of phone calls and fax messages between the executive's 9 members. She knows about the media. She sees it as a chain of conceptual spaces, with its own map of links and branches, occasionally intersecting with physical yet strangely disconnected locations like TV stations and radio stations. She knows there's definitely such locale as, say, Hit magazine, but one day it might exist at a table in a well-known restaurant, and the next it might exist in the foyer of an airport. You know, she's undergoing a fascinating transformation. What's most interesting, though, is that despite this lack of space, she feels more or less the same way as Valentine and an Angela. The human brain evolved to understand space, after all, and it's not going to give up now. She sees connections between virtual and cultural events as if they were locations, and just like everyone else, she's come to the conclusion that there are patterns hidden inside those connections. That there's something inside the culture, that deep down it's why she's so anxious about checking her appearance on video. One frame out of place, and it could escape. 0.36. Posture. Yeah, but you don't really believe that, do you? Says Horror. You don't really think there's something buried under the town? I believe in things you wouldn't believe, I believe, replies Inangela. Oh, grow up, says Horror. She's right. Inangela really should have put on her bone mask before saying that. It would have given her so much more authority, or at the very least, it would have allowed her to claim that she was being ironically melodramatic. Faction masks are good for that. 0.37. Continuity. I'm not sure I understand, says Father Denzeo. He's pacing the room behind Tiffany as she sits cross-legged and anxious, in front of the mass of TV sets. His black, leathery coats making swish noises across the artificial fiber carpet. He's too bulky to look as if he's hovering. Not that he'd care. Tiffany is struggling. She's trying to ignore all the tapes except the relevant 5, which she's rewound to roughly the right places. But her hands are shaking, and she needs cocaine to steady her nerves. Don't you dare laugh. And she can't sync them up properly. Her last attempt came closest to the mark, but Denzel was rather inconsiderately looking the wrong way at the time. There, see, she says. It's a lame effort. She synced two of the tapes together, and she's trying to concentrate on those. That's not right, you know. You don't think it's right? My head. I'm snapping my head to the right, yeah? I always snap my head to the right like that. Look. But she tries to pause the 2 tapes, fails, and then starts trying to rewind them. The machines move at different speeds, sadly. But I'm looking over the heads of the weirdos, the guys in the masks. Is he humoring her? Possibly. I should be looking away from the guys in the masks. Finally, Tiffany looks up at him, and the next words come perilously close to making her sound like a child. Shouldn't I? A different group of weirdos, suggests Denzel. There are quite a lot of them about. I understand the look's quite fashionable. He strokes the chin of his own mask as he says it, pushing the point home, but Tiffany shakes her head and keeps trying to re-summon the moment of crisis. It was wrong. You couldn't tell it was wrong? Could I? I think it's... You know. I know? This is the point when she makes her decision. She's already told Denzel about this, even though it might not be tacitly wise. It might not be tactically wise. She could barely help it, given her sense of shock just before he knocked on the door, but here she'd really have to cross the Rubicon, if she knew the meaning of the word. I want to talk to the executive, she announces. Her voice is, however, less impressively sonorous than Denzel's, except during the middle 8 of Time on Your Side, for some reason. Speaking, says Denzel. No, I mean, the executive. All of you. Aha, says Denzel. 0.38. Bloodletting. Oh, no. 0.38. Blooding. In Angela's motivation in performing her glucose-fueled maximum carbohydrate ritual is there for all to see, because she's a pop person. She has the sneaking suspicion that if she reinvents millennia of mystical thought in this way, then faction paradox, i.e. the real mythical faction paradox, will make itself known to her, inform her that as a chosen one, she's passed the initiation, and give her the opportunity to join. Because she's a very pop person, she intends to really prove her superiority by turning the faction down. Initiations are complicated like that. To an extent, she's just doing her duty as one of the new and immaculately dressed generation of ritualists. But more crucially, it's an obvious effort to make the world, at least her world, marginally more interesting. Now, in Angela remembers, very well, the night of the Now, in Angela remembers, very well, the night that the old Princess of Wales died. She was 15 at the time. Like many, if not most, people of her age, she always had a kind of vague dislike of royalty of any kind. Not for any overtly political reasons, but just because she felt they were chronically hopeless at the job, being far less capable and far less notable than, well, her, for a start. A sense of frustrated destiny rather than jealousy. The two feel completely different, and only look alike to people on the outside. And Angela was up late that particular night, caffeine pilling her way towards dawn, when the news reports about a car crash started coming in. Nothing critical at first, just, we're getting reports of an accident, couched in that special newsreader way which suggests, and we're not going to tell you everything just yet. And hearing this, Angela thought about the princess and said out loud to the screen, "Oh, please be dead." After all, her generation had never seen a royal death before, let alone one as brutal and as stupid as a car crash. Oh, please be dead. Things would be so much more interesting. She felt very, very guilty in the following weeks. Not because she'd wished someone dead, of course. A princess isn't a real person, any more than a raccoon on a chocolate wrapper qualifies as a real species. But because that early hour's wish, fueled by the vicious, ritual effects of the caffeine tabs, had backfired horribly in the way that most wishes do. The world became anything but interesting. It spent months trapped in a tyranny of good taste and sensitivity where no opinion was tolerated but the correct one, and certain words were exiled from the English language altogether. It's what happens when you show people death on the level. It's what happens when you show people death on that level of celebrity. I made a bad wish, and it made the world a much less interesting place. A week later, the homeless girl who used to hang around 2 streets away from Angela's house died after she coughed up her own throat lining. Naturally, nobody gave a damn about this, even though the girl was vastly more interesting than the princess, and once told Angela a fantastic, but entirely unproven, rumor about the way soldiers were brainwashed to fight in the war. It probably goes without saying that it was over a day before anyone moved the corpse. At this stage, Angela had never heard of faction paradox. This didn't stop her collecting some of the leftover blood from the girl's. This didn't stop her from collecting some of the leftover blood from the pavement, scraping up flecks of the girl's throat that could have been teeming with any number of narcotics. She must have instinctively known that they'd come useful later. 0.39. Safety. The girl in the mask is lying on her stretcher in the ambulance, and it's remarkable how different she looks. Here in the back of a sterility-white meat van, cut off from the flashing red and light of the square, she doesn't look anything like a casualty of war. Let's be honest, she just looks dead. The fact that one arm's crossed over her chest doesn't help, although, as far as death imagery is concerned, it's hard to ignore the mask. She's lying absolutely still now, and Valentine's hovering over her, lowering his head to her chest and making sure not to touch her torso. The breathing's not only erratic, but it's quite obviously pained. Each breath drawn out as long as possible, her lungs obviously knowing they've only got so many chances left. Now Valentine raises his head to look at Cos. Cos is standing on the other side of the ambulance's rear doors, his big, gangling body spread out His big, gangling body spread out across the opening like a spider monkey, one hand resting on the top left corner of the doorframe, one hand on the top right. The message is plain. It now takes the weight of an entire vehicle to stop him falling over. There's sweat all over the great bald expanse of his skull, and the lamplight just slides off it. Unlike Valentine, he doesn't seem concerned by the injured girl at all. Instead, his attention's focused elsewhere, apparently on the burning, crackling South American restaurant. "Does this look like a collapsed lung to you?" Valentine asks, cautiously. Cos spends a moment or two looking into the fire, then turns his head. "Can you smell something?" he grunts. As a matter of fact, Valentine can. A gutted restaurant will confuse the primal senses like nothing else in the world, gas or no gas, but he's not to be swayed. "I don't think it's a collapsed lung," he says insistently. "I think it's something else. Internal damage. I don't think we can do anything for her before we get to the hospital." Agrees Cos. "She's not going to make it." This thought had occurred to Valentine, but he really didn't want to say anyone. Really didn't want anyone to say it out loud. Without keeping his ear to the girl's body, he can no longer hear a single thing from behind the mask. "I can drive," he says. He doesn't trust Cos to get anywhere in a hurry right now. Cos shrugs, but his attention's already turned back to the fire. "Sure, I can smell something," he says. Then, unexpectedly, he takes a deep breath through his mouth. Valentine gets the feeling that he's trying to flood his lungs with fresh air, though God knows what's in his body that's bad enough to make fire smoke a preferable option. And then, suddenly Cos is gone. His big, aging, uniform monkey shape vanishing from the rear doorway of the ambulance. Valentine is frankly surprised that the man can move so fast. It reminds him of the explosion at the front of the restaurant, but this time in reverse, as some uncanny force rips Cos away from the vehicle and pulls him across the square at high velocity. 0.40 Non sequitur number 1. Only one side of the telephone conversation was recorded. Bugging the phone proved to be impractical for the simple reason that it was hard to know which phone to bug. The individuals who happened to be under surveillance had a certain reluctance to using the landline registered to the house and took to using mobile phones instead. They changed the numbers every few days, which shows wisdom, at least. Not quite enough, though, because it never seemed to occur to them that the house itself might be monitored. Fancy that. Technology was on their side, but simple geography let them down. The side of the conversation, which ended up on tape, the harsh, metallic, badly disguised woman's voice, with its muted accent and nicotine aftertaste, went like this. "Go. Yes. Yes. We understand that, Mr. Orphée. We appreciate your position. This isn't your area of expertise. We know, yes. We're sure. You've seen the same information as the rest of us. I don't need to explain anything. I know you do, Mr. Orphée. We understand. That's why we trust you. No. No, our sources are reliable. You can see that. There's no other possibility. Apart from a ship? No. There's no other possibility. Only a ship. Not now. It's already been buried. What do you expect? I can't tell you that yet, Mr. Orphée. I appreciate that. We're glad you understand. Yes. Yes. 0.41. Footnotes on the above. 1. Go, meaning safe, i.e., you can start talking. 2. The voice on the phone isn't talking to a superior. At best, there's a bank teller formality about the way she says Mr. Orphée. And at worst, there's an anger and an impatience that have to be held in check with military precision. Or maybe it's just the distortion on the recording that makes her sound like this. Like an old-fashioned razor scraping across the skin and occasionally pushing hard enough to break the skin. 3. A code name, surely. It's doubtful that you'll find any Orphées in the phone book, or even in the X-directory register. This town's inhabitants aren't inclined to be born with names quite so exotic. 4. Ah, herein lies a tale. I might reread that again for the points of how you can read it yourself. In fact, I fully recommend you read this book and buy your own copy of it. All right, sorry. 0.42 Invisibility Spell. The House of Marrero doesn't have any locks. Not locks that work, anyway. And Angela's friends, such as they are, like to make the obvious comment that nobody would ever want to steal it, but this is clearly untrue. Joyriders like nothing better than a big, loud, dangerous pile of clanking machine parts that makes a massive cartoon impact when you drive it into a wall. And Angela has her own security devices. She uses blood and she uses ritual, almost as if she were auditioning for Faction Paradox, because you never know when someone might be watching already. Whenever the machine gets parked, she takes the tin out of the glove compartment, opens it, and scatters a little of the blood inside and all around the van, in a loose circle. At least she calls the material in the tin blood, although by her own admission, blood, of the dried variety, is just one of many carefully refined ingredients. Its effect, so she says, is to form a ward not simply against theft, but also against parking tickets and petty vandalism. The blood she used, ostensibly, is the blood of the homeless girl who died down the road from her exactly 1 week after the passing of the old Princess of Wales. It makes sense. Aristocrats might like to think that their blood is somehow superior, but if that princess proved one thing, then it was that a noble birthright just isn't the issue. Some people have glamour in their veins. The dead girl, on the other hand, had anti-glamour. The ability, genetic or acquired, to be culturally irrelevant. As a result, the blood right has ensured that despite over 3 years of stupid parking, the House of Marrero has never ever been noticed. Anything within the circle ceases to be a meaningful part of the culture. On average, and Angela has used the blood right twice every day across that 3-year period. Horror has never bothered asking when the small amount of blood that an Angela collected from the dead girl's body is going to run out. One time she returned to the van to find that a traffic warden had slapped tickets on every car on the road except the House of Marrero, which is supporting evidence for an Angela's claims, but inconclusive. There's always the possibility that nobody goes near the vehicle because they think a van surrounded by blood is an official crime scene of some description, not to mention the possibility that an Angela personally printed up some fake tickets and put them on everybody else's cars just to prove a point. It wouldn't be beyond someone in self-training to be part of Faction Paradox. 0.43 Faction Paradox. Impossible to say where the idea of Faction Paradox came from. Easy to say how it became so popular. It's the war. Fashion always tends towards the outre when there's a war. It's like Vietnam and the hippies. It's like the Great British Psychosis, the distortion of time that took place during World War II, locking the nation into a state of permanent illusory empire at the very last moment when it actually held any power. See how the alteration of time perception is always important to the process? Even the hippies had their LSD. The original Faction Paradox, if there ever was such an animal, could have been anything. It could have been the result of a conscious, deliberately planned project devised by artists or musicians or ritualists. Alternatively, it could have been a corporate marketing campaign that fell by the wayside and got recycled by some club promoter who fished the first few prototype masks out of bins behind the offices and thought they'd look good on a fly poster. But it didn't take long for the faction to plant itself inside the mythology of wartime. Naturally, this scheme of things, Faction Paradox, is the only... Naturally, in this scheme of things, Faction Paradox is the only force, young, creative, dynamic, fetishistic, capable of derailing the war, as if the minority who wear the masks are serious opponents for whatever higher powers might currently be taking the town to pieces. Again, the distortion of time is an important factor, becoming not only a side effect of the faction's alleged mind-expanding techniques, but a weapon. The name, with its overtones of impossible history, is perfectly chosen. Faction Paradox has ostensibly been here since the start of the universe. This is why the posters seem so familiar. Children, and... This is why the posters seem so familiar, children, and not just because you saw them on your way home from a club while you were still off your face, and not just because of the blacks, whites, and glaring reds smashed their way into your impressionable skulls while you didn't know what you were doing. Faction Paradox is all about history, about breaking a military deadlock that's been around forever, and that if it hasn't been around forever yet, then there's a way... What? Faction Paradox is about history, about breaking a military deadlock that's been around forever. And if it hasn't been around forever yet, then there's a way, then that's the way it'll seem soon. One more time. And if it hasn't been around forever yet, then that's the way it'll soon seem. 0.44. Sick note. Valentine eventually finds Cause in a side alley between the amusement arcade and a less colorful, less conspicuous building, which may well be a lap dancing club of some description. Cause is standing next to the staircase, gripping the iron banister for support, back turned to the square. He's throwing up, and although he's not facing Valentine, he's sadly not completely facing the other way. Valentine stops halfway down the alley, where the prevailing smell is still meat and burning architecture. Politely, he waits until Cause has finished. He begins. He's not sure whether he needs to go on. He knows the score here. He knows that Cause knows... He knows that Cause knows that he knows the score. But Cause, even now his muscular contractions are over, doesn't turn around. You know, it almost looks like shame. Valentine decides to sum it up in one word. Pills, he says. Cause confirms. Strictly speaking, this is the moment when Valentine must make a decision. In truth, he's already made it, but he knows this is the point when things start to change, so he at the least reminds himself that this is a moment worth remembering. You don't need to come back with me, he says. Cause shakes his head, but keeps his eyes fixed on the ground in front of him, which can't be pleasant. We'd better get the girl in. I can do it on my own, Valentine tells him. Cause doesn't respond, doesn't move. I'll just go tell the others you stayed here, Valentine goes on, doing his best to sound like a son who's worried about his father, and hoping that he doesn't sound like a son who's about to put his father into a home. It's a war site. It's not like they're going to ask questions. You know, it's a busy night, the Tiffany Corta thing, and he trails off and waits for Cause to acknowledge him with a, Outside, there's the howl of sirens as the fire service reinforcements arrive. Valentine takes a step back, since here in the alley, the smell of the burning square is starting to lose the fight against the poison from Kaz's stomach. It's not a problem, Valentine concludes. Really. 0.45. Primal buttons. Before Valentine joined the service, Cause used to specialize in dead children. He was well known for it. However random the assignment were supposed to be, it was a dead cert that any given night the ambulance driven by Cause would roll into the hospital with at least one DOA minor on board. When Cause and Valentine started working together on night shifts, things began to change, as if Valentine's presence had somehow made a big dent in the probability away from kids and towards industrial accidents. But by then, the damage had been done. Theoretically, there's no difference between the body of a child and the body of a grown-up. In practice, every child is an implicate human, a stripped-down, abstract little bundle of all the things that a human being might possibly be, and it's so much easier to care about abstracts than people. It's why pop stars scratch away every complex detail of their lives and become little more than lists of anecdotes. It's why it's easier to care about the death of a cartoon character than a complex human being, and it may even be why Valentine hasn't yet removed the mask from the girl in the ambulance and turned her into a real person. It doesn't matter if you've been trained to do the professional medic thing. It doesn't matter if you think it doesn't make a difference to you, and it doesn't matter if you don't go home every night and dream about burning babies, because it never really works that way. It's the cumulative effect that wears you down. The cumulative effect of having your primal buttons pushed and your gut level levers pulled. None of those dead children were worth any more than any of the dead adults, and for all anyone knows, half of them could have grown up to be rapists, arm dealers, and child killers. But 0.46, the pills. But this is what led cause to the pills. All Valentine knows is that all Valentine knows is that they're pills made to keep someone moving at all costs, hence causes bouts of hyperactivity, which says something, don't you think? Cause doesn't take pills to forget, to be happier, or to regulate his blood pressure. He takes pills to make himself faster. The horror, and again, he didn't even know it was a horror at the time, has simply made him slow. The effect of the pills on his body is plain for all to see, however. Apart from the violent mood swings, a particularly busy day will require the ingestion of several doses. These extra doses don't mix well with stress, shock, or the smell of spicy sausage, and the truth is that at least 2 of these 3 elements are almost de rigueur for the night shift. None of the other crews is going to mention this problem in the same way they didn't mention it when one of their number took to drinking for the same basic reasons and spent 4 months driving an ambulance while pissed out of his head. Only the management is kept in the dark. Fundamentally, Cause knows that Valentine is right, and that no one will ask questions when a one-man crew rolls in. To Valentine, who spent much of the past week wondering how he's going to get rid of Cause on this particular night, it's like a work of providence. Everything will be solved in one moment of clarity. Well, so far so good. 0.47. The Coming of the Bastard Raccoon. There's an advert on the television set, and Angela's back is freezing from resting against the chiller cabinet. Her time perception's starting to click back into place. She wonders, only briefly, because she's got better things to do, or whether she's remembering the last hour in the right order. Was the TV program she's now remembering actually on, or was it something she saw a long time ago, shifted onto the screen in the white heaven of the stopover as a kind of mass broadcast out-of-body experience? Alternatively, was the program ever made at all? She flirts with the idea that her time perception has shifted to such a degree that it's changed human history, dropping long-dead authors into retro TV shows, but it seems unlikely. Concentrate. The advert on the TV screen. Animated commercial for something covered in chocolate. On the screen there's a cartoon ad sprite, a chubby little raccoon creature in the same colors as the snack wrappers, black stripes on red. And is that a ring through her nose? Perhaps she's a post-punk raccoon. She lives in the woods, but there are children in the bushes and they want her chocolatey goodness. She runs from them, somewhat coquettishly. I don't know if I said that word right, but there's no point dwelling on it. There's a secret land where everything is made out of these snacks, and only the raccoon knows how to lead them to the portal. But she wants to be caught. Dear God, can't the stupid children see how she wants to be caught? It's a trap, for Christ's sake, it's a trap! This is what pixies do. The bastard lying animal hybrid scum. And just for a second, Angela sights the real gates of the bastard raccoon's kingdom, and knows the animal represents a great and terrible power, and that power is hidden inside everything she touches, the advert especially. Like all pixie people, it only shows itself occasionally. It takes human form, but it has no body, at least not in the normal sense of the word, and the bastard raccoon is peering at her. Little bright eyes, trying to see into Angela's desires from under her cropped red corporate hair. The animal bristles, and Angela can see her piercings. "What?" says Horror. "What?" says Angela. This evidently throws Horror off for a second, and she very nearly runs the van off the road. 0.48. Here we are, back in the real world. "God," says Horror as she regains control. "What was that about?" And Angela shakes her head. There's no good reason for that. It's just what she's seen people do when they're trying to clear their minds. She says, "It's all right. I thought I was somewhere else." Notably, and Angela doesn't apologize for this outburst. That wouldn't be seemly. "I think your head's coming off," says Horror. She makes it sound like a comment about the weather. "Where did you think you were, then?" "Watching television." "Pfft, that's a real shit drug you've taken. You could stay at home and watch television properly." "I haven't taken any drugs," snaps Angela. "Oh, it's probably a side effect of the ritual. I told you. It's a very intense process." She pauses. Then, "Horror? Yeah? Why does my hand feel squishy?" Horror glances to one side, but just with her eyes, without turning her head. As Angela knows, Horror has seen far too many medical dramas in which the week's victim has an accident after looking at the person in the passenger seat. "You could try looking at your hand if you really want to know," Horror suggests. "Will I be really pissed off by what I see, though?" Horror shrugs. "Do you get freaked out by melty chocolate bars?" Ah, yes. Now when Angela remembers reaching into her leathery coat pocket, seizing the chocolate within, deciding that there was something fundamentally evil about it, and resolving to throw it out of the window. "Just tell me one thing," she says, still not looking back at the now boomerang-shaped snack that was once a bar of some description. "What's on the wrapper?" "Lots of chocolate," says Horror truthfully. "No, I mean, is there an animal?" Horror grunts to herself. "Is this about your totem animal thing? 'Cause you know, I don't think it matters if you eat the chocolate bar with the wrong kind of animal on it." "It's not that," says Angela, crossly. Crossly is very different to angrily. It involves the thrusting of hands into pockets, chocolate covered or not. "I just thought you were a raccoon." "Right," says Horror. 0.49. The Coronation. There was a certain occasion, not 3 weeks ago, which was of particular significance to Angela, and which needs to be recorded here if we're to understand her properly. It was on a night when she and Horror were hanging around the car park of the local Cineplex, a good place for them to hang out, since there are fast foods outlets waiting in the shadows on all sides, and there's enough space on the forecourt for a beast of the machine like the House of Mordred. They'd been there for some time, under the great and all too meaningful expanse of the night sky, which naturally represents a future of infinite potential as much as it does a vacuum. Occasionally threatening to run over the teenage boys who laughed at an Angela's mask or Horror's face. Eventually, one of the cinema attendants came out of the building and asked them what they were waiting for, and Horror drawled something like, "We're waiting for the star premiere," which is frankly typical of her. The man from the Cineplex said they should leave, but Angela was fairly hyper at that stage. In retrospect, she admits, shamefully so, and clambered up onto the bonnet of the van, spreading her arms wide and explaining that she was queen of the world. That was when the shockwave hit them. The boom that goes beyond sonic, so everybody within half a mile must have jumped out of their skins, even the queen of the world. There was a pillar of fire in the fields and the wastes beyond the Cineplex, and afterwards the attendant looked so shell-shocked that he couldn't in all conscience ask anybody to leave. A pillar of fire, bright as a sunburn, the closest in Angela had ever been to any part of the war until now. But even those who claimed to have been closer admitted they'd never seen anything like that before. As if some great and paranoid ship of the war had dumped its entire payload into the ground. But here's the important thing. The important thing to note about an Angela, with her fetishes and trinkets and very personal and very private mystery artifacts. Nothing as impressively alchemical as red mercury, perhaps, but particularly urban signifiers nonetheless. A week later, briefly but obsessively convinced that she was missing something important, she went out to a field where that attack had left its mark in the earth and lay there, at the dead center of the crater, in the grey dust and shattered dirt. For 44 hours of her life, 44 hours cut off from the world as we know it, separated from the foods of convenience and the satellite feed. Is it really such a great sacrifice? Perhaps not, on the grand scale of things. But these are high-velocity times. Mystics of past generations would starve themselves for weeks on end. These days it takes only hours to reach the same level of isolation and awareness and sudden primal understanding. Is that a bad thing? 0.50. Sleeping. And Angela became aware of something while she was out there in her wilderness, suffering from 44-hour hunger, and realizing just how small a chemical imbalance it takes to turn a fashion-conscious young woman into a new prophet. There in the crater, she became convinced that there really was something in the ground underneath her. Not an urban, mythical, gut-level horror, the kind she expected when she was so much... There we are. The kind she expected when she was so much younger and more prone to believe in things full-time, but real nonetheless. Something that needs to be awoken, perhaps. Most teenagers feel that way. That's why they make so much noise, why they try to leave such brutal scars on the skin of the world, because they can sense something sleeping under the surface and know that life would be so much better and faster and more fascinating if it woke up. Perhaps that's what the ritual of an Angela's is all about. She tells herself that all of this has to do with the protocols of faction paradox, but if she's honest with herself, then she knows that she's just trying to make that wake-up call. Maybe to wake up something in herself. Maybe something in the ground. Who knows? The point is, she half-starved herself to get that far. She may only believe in things for short periods, as any sensible human being does these days, but you can't fault her dedication. When she's got a mission, she's really got a mission. 0.51 on red mercury. Red mercury, incidentally, is the most mythical and most meaningful and, with one key exception, the most potent and illegal or semi-legal elements on the market. A power it gains from existing at the intersection of politics, mysticism, organized crime, and even fashion. It's therefore the ultimate medium. Its reputation not at all harmed by the fact that it sounds as if an alchemist encoded its name. Like any brand, it guarantees that anything bearing its name can be sold at higher prices than the more commonplace illicit materials. The term seems to originate in the late 1970s, but didn't properly become widespread until the late 1980s or early 1990s. On a global scale, that time period has been an obvious significance. The fall of the Berlin Wall, the decline of communism, happy Eastern Europeans tearing down statues of Stalin even as they made plans to escape the country or eat their own dogs. To most Westerners, the end of the Cold War meant a glorious new age of terrorism, the fear of the chemical rather than the atomic. To the specialist underworlds, it meant a brand new source of supplies. The label Red Mercury was most famously given to the material smuggled out of the Soviet Union. The name initially applied to a supposed variant of literal mercury, which ostensibly functions as a high-grade trigger in nuclear weaponry. Later, the term broadened its horizon, covering any potentially nuclear matter. That emigrating Soviet technicians smuggled out of legendary underground laboratories. Soon, however, the phrase took on a whole new meaning. After all, would anybody really give a name as dramatic, as fundamental, as red mercury to any common, vulgar, quasi-atomic material? No. It implies mystery, and therefore its mystery has to be resolved. It was clear, said the dealers of such commodities, that red mercury served a very specific function. All those spitting, crackling, murky little vials of liquid were just a smokescreen, confused with the true red mercury, a creature so powerful that its qualities could only be described in terms verging on the ritualistic. By 1991, the true red mercury had been identified, though its pedigree was unclear. By 1992, it was not only being sold to those who might want to produce their own limited nuclear devices in the West, but also in small doses, as practitioners of Vodan, the ritualists and black chemists of the Western Caribbean. These were high times for those who practiced Vodan, Obeah, and sundry forms of sympathetic magic. This was the era in which camcorders experienced a massive sales boom in Western Africa, as witch doctors realized videotape was far more efficient way of capturing someone's image than a clay doll. Nuclear material had been, for so many years, the prime Vodan substance, by which rulers of the East and West had kept their followers under control. Now, any ritualist could get a hold of it, second-hand, for whatever they saw fit. Like a piece of clothing that's dipped in the blood of a great leader. Red mercury was matter which had passed through the secret subterranean research labs of the USSR, picking up not only the radiation, but the buried secrets of the Soviet occult science. This was matter which knew the world, which had a power and a purpose all its own. Not that the dealers kept its origins in mind. Things tended to become over-literal given time. Before long, the traders in this commodity were painting vials of ordinary humdrum mercury with red nail varnish in order to give it the correct hue. .52. Sweet. Tiffany's executive is staying on a floor of the hotel all to itself. The floor is numbered 13.5, and only certain lifts in the building can access it. Returning to the hotel later, Tiffany will find the staff unwilling to admit that there ever was a 13.5 floor, and all records will show that Tiffany stayed here all on her own. No, not really, but it'd be fitting somehow. When Tiffany and Denzel step out of the lift into the muted light of the corridor with its velvet decor and its faux royal red carpet, they find one of the other members already waiting for them. It's Mother Nod, of course. She and Denzel mirror each other perfectly. Whenever Denzel performs an unseemly errand for Tiffany, it's always Nod who turns up to fuss about it, to make twittering noises and potter about like a maid who thinks she's going to have to clean up the mess. "Where have you been?" Nod hoots, obviously addressing Denzel, even if she gives Tiffany a glance, making it clear who's supposed to suffer the shrapnel of the question. You can't seriously ask a pop star where they've been. Tiffany sometimes wonders what Nod looks like behind her mask, suspecting she'd be like a painting she once saw, or an advert of a painting she once saw, of a light-bulb-headed man with his face squeezed into an enormous scream. Tiffany imagines Mother Nod's face contorted into the same expression, but scrunched into the shape of the mask. "The princess wants a word," says Danzale. Nod flusters without saying anything, waving her hands in a wait here expressions. She's probably not sure she should allow this, but is there really any way of stopping it? The executive is Tiffany's executive, and besides, it's fairly obvious that the other seven members have already assembled in one room. White-shirted hotel staff are, even now, sweeping in and out through the door. They move as if they're riding unicycles, shifting their body weight to and fro in order not to spill the drinks. For reasons which really should be obvious, all the drinks have straws. 0.53. Valentine's Rubicon. Valentine crouches on the floor of the ambulance, back against the inside wall, hands cats cradled together in front of his face. He's listening, very, very carefully. For the most part, he's listening to the sound of the girl's lungs, but the rear doors of the ambulance are wide open, so there's the crackling of the fire and the roar of the fire hoses and the conversations of the sirens. He doesn't want to get any closer to the girl. He really doesn't. He's on his own here now. Just him and a girl who may be dead already. He could lean in closer, feel her pulse, risk putting his head to her chest to listen for a beat, but really, her exact biological status no longer seems the issue. Her life or death has, he's sure, already been decided. If you wanted to be cruel, you could say that he's just seeing patterns again, beyond the right here and nowness of the situation. No, he's not superstitious, in the everyday sense. But the rocket attack? The girl? That moment of decision in the alley? Everything seems to fit together here. Besides, what chance does the girl really have? Even Cause said she was doomed. She'll need surgery, Valentine's in no doubt about that. God knows how long it'll take them to even organize the procedure, let alone open her up in a bleached room with needle-sharp lights and fix the damage. There's no way in the world that she's going to make it, even if she's still alive. But it has to be said, here Valentine's just rationalizing. He already knows where this line of thought's leading him, and what he's going to do next. But, as in the alleyway, he wants to make sure of every step on the way. Nothing he does can be casual. Here we go. He's getting ready to shut the doors, climb into the driver's seat, and start the engine. He isn't planning on heading for the hospital. He is planning on tearing his eyes away from the girl in the mask, but it might take a few moments. On 3. 1, 2, 0.54. The secret route. The mission has begun. And Angela is on her way towards the edge of the town, as unstoppable as her driver is unkillable, to perform the first of the ritual acts which she intends to dedicate to the wholly fictional name of Faction Paradox. The ritual she intends to perform? No. The ritual she must inevitably perform is a form of summoning, of a particularly urban kind, as befits the rest of her own urban mythology. Summonings aren't new to her, though she's never before attempted anything on this kind of scale. Until now, the most tangible thing she's ever called into existence is the last bus home. Anyone who lives in a town like this one, who's let the alcohol do its work on their time perception, and has gone through adolescence, leaving it just that tiny little bit too late to leave the pub after last orders, will tell you all about the late bus home. Sometimes you can catch it, and sometimes you can't. Sometimes you'll think it's too late, that you've got no way back to the safety and central heating and pastrami in the fridge and a better place to sleep than a doorway of an old bookshop. But then the lights will appear from around the corner, and the last bus home will change everything you thought you knew about the world. Sometimes you'll wait an hour for it, and more, and it won't come at all, and you'll believe that you'll never see home again. There's only one last bus home, and it can be summoned if you know the correct combination of words and actions and props. And Angela knows this better than anyone, which is why she sometimes carries a lighter, even though she doesn't smoke, why she insists on filling her pockets with coins that are no longer legal currency and pieces of litter that mark the secret route it makes through the world. And Angela becomes aware, suddenly, that horror is looking at her. The English word, should anyone ever choose to use it, is askance. It'd be going too far to say that horror looks worried, since horror automatically assumes that everyone else in the world is capable of casual survival as she is. If there's any concern, it's concern that Angela's about to bug out and do something embarrassing. What? Angela asks her. You were phasing out again, horror tells her. Angela attempts to regain her dignity. I'm just sensitive right now, she says defensively. Very nearly true. Angela almost put herself in hospital when she half-starved herself to the point of revelation. That's how serious she can be, when she's decided what to be serious about. She has her pride, but that was 13 days ago. She's out of the wilderness now. She spent most of the intervening time recovering, the rest of it just watching television and eating and planning. Horror still askancing at her, Angela is seriously thinking about glaring back. I'm not spacing out, she says. Huh, says Horror. I'm not. 0.55. A to B. Okay, says Horror. Which turning do you want? Head southwest, says Angela. She knows this because she already checked the local A to Z. We want to go past Miss Ruth's place on the way back, she adds in the hopes that it'll clarify things. Horror makes an noise so guttural it barely exists at all. We have to tell her about the ritual, Angela explains. It's bound to affect her. How? Because it'll affect everything. What? You're drawing some pictures on a wall. What, you drawing some pictures on a wall somewhere is going to... Miss Ruth has a right to know, says Angela, and to get to the point across, she makes sure that every little word is a little louder than the last. Horror shrugs it off. She at least seems to know where she's going now. The road curves ahead of the house of Mordred, an infinite supply of white street lamps appearing from round the bend before disappearing into the rearview mirror. Horror lazily flicks the indicator switch, which may or may not have an effect on the world outside the car, before swerving across the road towards one of the turnings. From somewhere behind them, there's the sound of a siren, and Angela knows this environment well. It's not enough to tell the difference between the three species of emergency vehicle from just the noise. For now, she assumes it's an ambulance, rather than a police car. Horror looks at her out of the corner of her eye. Keep going, says Angela. 0.56. Manifest Destiny. The idea of using videotape as part of the ritual process isn't new, and it certainly isn't unique to the camcorder shamans of West African. I think it's meant to be just West Africa. The idea of using videotape as part of the ritual process isn't new, and it certainly isn't unique to the camcorder shamans of West Africa. In the more media-literate circles of the Western world, for example, the kind of circles in which Tiffany's executive might move, possibly counterclockwise, there are rumors of a personal future lifestyle consultant who's capable of reading someone's past, present, and future just by the impact they've made on the world's media. If you've ever walked past a news camera while the reporter was delivering an on-the-spot report, or been filmed in the crowd at some obscure music festival you thought everyone had forgotten, then she'll know it. She'll know you, and she'll be able to trace your life through that one tiny moment when your existence intersected with the magnetic tape version of the history of the world. No celebrity has ever dared face this witch. Just imagine her, prophesizing on the life of someone whose image has already been captured on a billion frames of video. She'd know them better than they even know themselves, and faced with that, they might cease to exist altogether. Tiffany Corta has heard this rumor, probably at an executive party somewhere. She may have even been told where to find this urban legend of a witch woman, though it's not information she consciously remembers at this stage. Meanwhile, in the vast and bewildering human landscape of India, those actors who play major deities in the nation's great mythic quasi-religious soap operas are treated as if they are the literal embodiments of gods and goddesses in question. And who's to say they aren't? If you were a god, how the hell would you manifest yourself? Given the choice, you'd be safer as an advertising sprite than as a human being. 0.57. Cut to the chase. Police car, says Horror. And Angela has been thinking the same thing, but she isn't going to acknowledge it, just because Horror said the words out loud. Until she looks into the wing mirror and establishes beyond any reasonable doubt that the wailing, impolite vehicle closing in from behind isn't really just a fire engine, then it doesn't exist as a police car. Go faster, says Angela. Uh-huh, says Horror. What if they want us to pull over? Why would they want us to pull over? Snaps at Angela. We haven't done anything. And what she means is, we haven't done anything yet. What she's going to do, tell people for years to come that she would have woken the great urban horror. What she's going to do, tell people for years to come that she would have woken the great urban horror, no relation to her horror, of course, but that she didn't want to get stopped for speeding. We'll be doing over 60, Horror points out, plus one of the indicators is fucked. Just go faster, says and Angela says. Horror hesitates, but not for long. What's the worst that can happen? The police can arrest her, potentially, but Angela doubts it bother Horror a great deal. In fact, the two of them met for the first time in the holding cell of a police station, although nobody has yet ascertained what Horror did to get there. So, all right, says Horror, and there's a clonk as her foot goes down on the pedal. And Angela can't resist it any longer, and as the house of Mordred accelerates along the road, she risks a glance in the wing mirror on the side of the van. This is the same kind of mistake Orpheus made in the underworld, incidentally, except that Orpheus didn't have a wing mirror, and perhaps things would have been very different if he had. But all Angela sees is a flash of white against the dark black background. One big, powerful headlight bouncing off the glass at exactly the right angle to sting her eyes. Got to be following us, says Horror, and the siren's still getting louder. 0.58. The Executive. The Executive has done a fine job of turning the hotel room into its home from home, so much that the space seems to have followed them all the way from the last hotel where they stayed, and the one before that, and the one before that. There's no bed here, the centerpiece of the room being an enormous semicircular table around which the Executive holds conference, so implacable and so immovable that it proves this is the same room. There are red shades over the dimmed lights, casting the 7 bone faces behind the table in the kind of glow that reminds Tiffany of the people she saw by the firework light. No embarrassing papier-mâché here, though. These masks are the best, leaving Tiffany in no doubt that once again she's in the company of the originals, the artifacts of which all the other faction masks are simple, grainy, nth-generation pirate copies. Nor would these 9 be seen, dead or otherwise, in standard festival wear. It suits all the way for them, in tweed or just plain grey, their hands, some folded on the table in front of them, some gracefully taking drinks from the hotel staff that bustle in and out, hidden in the elegant gloves in black leather or red velvet or white lace, depending on gender and or preference. Don't you worry about people seeing you like this, Tiffany once asked, when she was only a very small cultural entity and hadn't seen her executive meeting in a hotel before. At that stage, she still liked to think of the group as a kind of precious secret. No, one of them told her with a dismissive, highly cultured wave of the hand. Why would they ever think they were looking at the genuine articles? This is the great thing about everyone following our sense of fashion, A second, possible mother nod, added, "It's the ultimate camouflage." 0.59. Committed. The ritual involves 5 minor acts of sabotage, all performed in sequence. Originally, Angela wanted to carry out the first act at midnight precisely. Not that midnight has any particular importance to either herself or the invisible patrons of Faction Paradox, but it's midnight. For heaven's sake, how can you resist midnight? She tries not to let this bother her. It's always midnight somewhere, and Faction Paradox isn't worth a great deal if it can't bend the exact rules of timing a little. But now the project's already in jeopardy. The wailing vehicle's still right behind the van, doing everything it can to make horror pull over. Though, fortunately, it takes a lot more than a loud noise to stop horror. It takes loud noises and a lack of food. Since the house of Mordred has never been pulled over before in all the time Angela has known it, she has to wonder whether the police are after her on this particular night just to stop the summoning. For all she knows, there might be special agencies that deal with this sort of thing. This is no more paranoid than anything else you might hear these days. In wartime, you can take it as read that people are going to pay extra careful attention to the world, whether they're counter-terrorism forces or just PR agents making sure they know exactly where the man on the street stands. Intelligence and market research. In wartime, what's the difference? "Shit," says Horror. And Angela focuses on the road beyond the windscreen and sees what's caused this outburst. There's no traffic up ahead, at least not going the same way as the van, which is something. There's a crossroads, though. Traffic lights on every side, the occasional smear of white as other vehicles go from left to right across the junction. The lights themselves are red, the first signs of real color that they've seen for quite some time. The world is making it quite clear that this is the place to stop. So Angela says, without even thinking about it, "Keep going." "What about the red? They won't follow us." "I thought the police could do that kind of—" "Go!" shrieks Angela. And suddenly the van's lurching to one side, and for a moment Angela thinks that Horror's panicking after having someone shout in her ear and can't keep the vehicle under control. But the van's going faster than Angela thinks. The truth is, they've already reached the lights, and it's much, much too late to do anything about it now. The sound of shrieking is the sound of the tires moving sideways across the road, but it's not altogether clear whether they're the tires of the van or the tires of something coming the other way. There are headlights everywhere, and Angela tilts to one side and bangs the side of her head against the window on the passenger side. The glass is cold and sticky. But now it's all over. There's nothing but a road, framed by white streetlights on either side, leading out towards the edge of town. There's no traffic ahead. You can still hear the yelling of the horns, the sound of cars trying not to scar each other in the confusion, and the howling of a siren that gets further and further away as its lights get smaller and smaller in the wing mirror. And Angela looks at Horror, and Horror's eyes are fixed on the road, half open as usual. "Yeah," notes Horror, "you're right. They haven't followed us." That's it. They've crossed the line. They've committed. How much more committed can you possibly get? And with that, we are going to end tonight's reading. I would like to thank you for your listening. I hope that I've been helpful in getting you into a sleepier state, and I hope that you've enjoyed this story. Once again, this has been Faction Paradox. This town will never let us go. Thank you for listening, and thank you for... I need to script this, really. Thank you for listening to this broadcast from the dark corners of the earth.